There is a through line, I promise. We can talk about it afterwards.
So tell us a little bit about your background with water.
The origin story is my parents met in a swimming pool in Hong Kong. And I think that kind of says it all. My dad was a lifeguard, my mom is a wonderful swimmer, and we just grew up. Um, my brother and I grew up in New York and Jones Beach. Like we learned to swim when we were 5 years old and joined the swim team and then became lifeguards ourselves and taught swimming lessons. And I just feel like that was always a part of my life. And as I grew older, I realized that, and I, again, a wide ranging, I'm a journalist who's a generalist, right? So I would travel for work and then I would always kind of like seek out a swimming pool. Whatever assignment I was on, I would always kind of, sometimes I would do a little side story, for the travel section about swimming a body of water that I wanted to swim in that gave you particular view of that place, like swimming from Alcatraz in San Francisco. And I never, I live in Berkeley and I've lived in the Bay Area for 20 years, but until I swam from Alcatraz, I didn't understand really where I was until I could see that like fisheye view or seal eye view, whatever you want to call it, sea lion eye view of the Golden Gate Bridge from below. And it was just so cool. And then the currents sucking us out, I mean, if we didn't swim fast, we were going to be out to sea in the Pacific under the Golden Gate Bridge. And it was just so, I love to see the world from the water. It really situates me in a way, in the landscape, in the oceanscape that I don't get anywhere else.
So how
Um,
much time do you spend in the water?
Most mornings, I'm either surfing or swimming. Yeah, that's my ritual.
And where do you swim? When you say swimming, where do you go?
So because I'm surfing a lot now, I'll probably swim in my local pool. But that's its own, like circumscribed. I think there's probably a lot of swimmers here. Yeah, yeah, I see that. Um, Swimming in a pool is different than swimming in open water, but it has its own meditative beauty. You know your body knows where you're going to be when you do your turns, and also you know how you feel when you plunge into the water is going to be different from the way when you come out. How you feel, and I think that knowing that is a comfort. And I think swimming in open water. I know there's some of you who want to do it, and are a little nervous about doing it, but that's a whole other thing. That's to me that lives in the same realm as surfing, where the ocean can be your friend, but it can also be your foe. It's like wrestling with the water in a way that also feels really good. Makes me feel very alive when I do it, but it's different. It's different.
So like you, I've been around water all my life. My dad, when he was an elementary school teacher, supplemented his income by teaching swimming. So I started swimming at an early age in a pool. My dad loved going to the ocean. He wasn't a surfer, but he just loved being in the water. So interesting that my mom never learned to swim, was scared, and we're going to talk about that. She was panicked. She would only sit on the side of a pool. She wouldn't even walk in the pool. She was so afraid of the water. But when I was asked to first interview you about why we swim, the book turned out much different than what I thought. I thought it was going to be about us swimming and how to swim and things of that nature. So, do you have to be a swimmer to read your book and enjoy your book?
No, and one of my favorite letters to get is from someone who writes and says, "I didn't think I was going to like this book," or I didn't think, I mean, I know why I swim or why I don't swim, right? Like, or it doesn't light me up, or I don't feel at home in the water. And I actually, to your point about learning to swim or not learning to swim at an early age and kind of maybe having that lifelong fear of the water, it is so second to the letters that are like, I didn't think I was like this book, and I actually learned a lot and I love it, and I just joined the Y. Uh, uh, are the letters that I get that are, I have been afraid of water my whole life. I am 60, 70 years old. I read this book and I signed up for swimming lessons, and now I swim twice a week with my friends. And I see some of these women at my local pool, so I have a relationship with them. And it's so, every time I see them, I think, you now have opened this window in your life to something that was always closed to you because it was so scary. And that, I mean, that is a such intense bravery because it is a life or death thing to know how to swim. And I get this kind of, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it because when I hear that, when I see that, and then I see the joy that this person has and gets to have buoyancy in their life in a way that they never had before, it's just fills my heart.
So I'm always intrigued why an author picks a particular title. So this is kind of a two-part question. When did you decide to write a book about why we swim? And when did you pick the title, Why We Swim? And why did you pick that title?
So, um, as to why I wrote the book about swimming, so I mentioned that whenever I would travel, start, I didn't even think I was writing about swimming really. I was just doing a thing that I liked. And then I would realize that a lot of those stories that I wrote, I would get a lot of feedback about them and people would respond, or I'd write an opinion piece and, in the Times and I would get a piece about like, oh, this is, the swimming being the last refuge from connectivity was one of the pieces I wrote for the New York Times. And that was like an avalanche. And my editor was kind of like, have you ever thought about writing a book about swimming? And I thought, well, no. Well, I love swimming, but what about swimming? What can I do? What can I bring to the topic? And so because I'm a journalist, I just kind of sought out, I started being like a little magpie collecting stories and um, just kind of filing them away in my mind. And over a few years, I had amassed enough stories that, like, I followed my curiosity to the places where, Icelandic fishermen who swam
Right, we're
six,
going to talk
yeah,
about that.
Leif, Gulliger Friðþórsson, survived a shipwreck. Or, the Bajau and the Moken, the sort of like uh, water. I guess they live on the water in what is today like Thailand and all of these island uh, places where learning to swim as a child was more important than learning to run or learn, for the first thing. And the babies, like, there's a whole mythology built around like um, why that is, right? And the life on the water. And I just kind of like collected them,
So
and
you were
then
researching all along then, mostly for
yeah,
articles at a time, but then
yeah.
gathering this information.
Or I would just be working on other things, and then, in I knew that I wanted to write this book when I would do it at night, or when I wasn't on the weekends. Like I think your mind is restless and it doesn't want to stop thinking about it.
So where did the title come?
Well, I realized I ended up having all of these stories, and I didn't really know. I knew I had good material, but I didn't really know how to organize it. And I started talking to friends and really editors I trusted. And I had just this brilliant editor at Random House, which is a friend of mine, and she said, "You got great stuff here. Why don't you just call the book something as simple as Why We Swim? And that way everyone knows what it's about." And then, as a writer, you're just so excited when someone tells you that, when you have an editor friend or a writer friend or anybody just kind of give you that one little thing that makes, I kid you not, everything just fell into place. Like I had suddenly all these five buckets, and the book is organized in that way where it's survival, community, competition, flow, like all these things where these hold all the reasons why we swim. If first and foremost survival, but then you can find the pleasure, you can find the well-being, you can find the um, flow and the community and all of that. Yeah,
So I love the cover. Simple.
it feels like a pool. Just jump in that.
So you talked about the sections and tell me how the order came about. How did you figure out what order for those five sections?
Well, obviously survival. That's number one. And so I kind of wanted to go back to the desert for that, right? So there were first, I started with the story of Gudliger Friðþórsson, who is an Icelandic fisherman.
Wait, you heard her pronounce that name and I've never tried it. And I'm going to spell it for you. Guolaugur. Great.
Gudliger
Last name Friorssson.
Friðþórsson.
Can you see why I didn't pronounce it? So,
Just
so
call him
tell
lawyer.
us about him because it's probably the most memorable story in the book. When anybody who's read the book and they know I'm going to interview you, though the Iceland. So tell us about him.
So, this is a story my husband told me one night over dinner, and that's how the book opens. And my husband works in oceans and climate, and so I think an Icelandic friend of his had told him about this fisherman who, in 1984, in the winter, dead of winter, was out on a fishing vessel off of the coast of Iceland, and
Not Greenland. Sorry.
not
I'm
Greenland.
I'm sorry.
We got that geography right. Real small. Greenland, very large. Anyway, and like Iceland is one of those places where, fishing lore, people live a life of the water, for many, many centuries. And and then his boat capsized and everyone was thrown into water, 41-degree water. Um, Everyone else quickly drowned, including the captain, and he ended up swimming 6 kilometers over 6 hours back to his. So this is actually a small island called Heimaey off the coast of the main island of Iceland. And there's a little lighthouse, and he followed that light for 6 hours. And he came up onto the island, um, and it was where the cliffs are like sheer. He had to get back in the water and swim around to the beach, and he's like crawling up. He's wearing, a sweater and jeans, and then he walks to the first light of the house that he sees in the village. Um, and like there's a trail of bloody footprints in the snow up to this house. And so they get him to the hospital and like they can't discern his heartbeat. It's like a very weird situation where they're just like how are you alive? And then they realize that he shows no signs of hypothermia. He's just a little dehydrated. And he's like this 23-year-old guy, fisherman. He It turns out, so they did a lot of studies, like British and Icelandic researchers. He consented to doing these studies where they found out that his body fat was like 2 to 3 times normal human thickness and more um, dense. So he was basically like a human seal. They called him that in the papers, like all over the world. And so to me, this story is so amazing because it's the confluence of, this biological quirk saved him, right? Kept him warm. His core body temperature was stable as during his swimming. But also that in Iceland, the culture was that if you're a fisherman, if you're doing any kind of seafaring stuff, like swimming is really important. So he learned to swim, very young. He was a very good swimmer. And only in the meeting of those two, like the sort of cultural evolution of as us humans, we pass on the knowledge of swimming generation over generation because it's important. Like, right? All different cultures have different ways of teaching swimming and learning swimming, and it's not something that we humans are very unusual amongst terrestrial mammals because we don't know how to swim instinctively from birth. We have to be taught, and so we do that. And why? So survival is one, and that's like that kind of anchor story of that survival section.
And he became a legend.
The legend. And so I went, so he's also famously reclusive. And so I wrote him a letter. Like I I think I wrote it in English and then I ran it through Google Translate and I printed it out and I got his address. Um, and I mailed it to him and I tracked it. It was so old fashioned. I tracked it across the ocean. And then I got this alert one day, an email that says like it's arrived. And then that day I got an email from him and he said, no, no, I don't want to talk to you. I appreciate that you've written to me, but I've had very bad experiences with the press because he's like county. He lives in this tiny town in Iceland, and people are just constantly like coming to his house or finding him. So he's very distinctive. He's like this big, 6'3" guy with like a big silvery beard. He looks like Santa Claus, but like a Hemingway crossed with Santa Claus. But we started writing each other. We became pen pals. So I wrote to him for a year before. So every year, on the anniversary of the swim in which of his swim, there is a swim in Iceland called Gudlugsund, and people swim the 6 kilometers. All the school kids do it, the swim teams do it in the pools in honor of what he was able to accomplish, but also he started doing this to raise awareness for, or people started doing this to raise awareness for these self-deploying lifeboats, because at the time, the technology was that they were supposed to have installed these self-deploying lifeboats onto all these fishing vessels in Iceland, but they hadn't yet. And so all of his friends and crewmates died, and he, in the beginning, the first few years after that accident, he was very, he did overcome his shyness and his resistance to being in the spotlight too, um, because when they were holding onto the boat's keel and it was going down, they said like, if if one of us survives, we have to tell what happened. And he said to me, "Oh my God, I will never." I get
You got to
goosebumps
meet
just
him,
hearing this.
right?
Yes, and he said, most of the time when things like this happen, there's no one left to tell, but I was, and so I had to tell. And so a year after we started writing each other, I went to Iceland to do the swim, and I did not know whether or not, like I did for the up until the moment in which he's standing in front of me in his truck picking me up to go for a drive around the island. I did not know if he was going to meet me. But we had kept writing and we just had like this wonderful rapport. But I think what I always say about this experience, what it taught me, and now like we are great friends and he's met my kids, my husband, like we've gone to visit him, met his wife, spent time with him. And every once in a while we still write to each other to kind of see how each other's doing. But it is I am not a patient person by nature, and that taught me to be patient because really like the you have to earn people's trust, and I take that very seriously. I take that responsibility. This guy's story, he didn't talk. There was after a couple of years, he didn't talk to anybody. When I was visiting him, there was like a bunch of French documentarians who had come to the island to kind of talk to him, and he's like running away from them. Japanese journalists were calling him. It's just wild because his story compels us in some way. We want to know what was it like to survive.
So what I loved about the book was there were so many facts about swimming that I had never heard of, didn't know. So kind of like a lightning round. Um, First known record of swimming. What's the first known record of swimming?
Cave of Swimmers. You probably have all heard this from the English Patient. There was this Hungarian explorer named Laszlo Almasi, and he discovered this cave in the middle of the Sahara uh, and outside of what's Niger border there. And there are these swimmers breaststroking up the walls of this cave in the middle of the desert. And at the time, he had speculated, oh, these people did these drawings and there was swimming around here. And at the time, people thought he was crazy because climate change isn't real back then either. His editor has to write a disclaimer in the book saying like, um, I don't support his theories. But of course, decades later, many all of his theories of this lake bed, all these dried lake beds with bones of fish, giant Nile perch, like turtles, like were found like all around this area. And so, of course, that was the time of the Green Sahara because of these shifting climate patterns, and that part of the Sahara was green, and there were shallow lake systems, and that was a paleo lake system.
Benjamin Franklin.
He loved to swim naked in the Thames.
And he invented something
Picture it or
too.
don't picture it.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Swim paddles, swim paddles,
Yeah,
swim paddles.
Leonardo da Vinci.
He had this like a great inventor, but he had these sketches, I think, for this device that would hold you while you were learning to swim. Yeah.
So I'd love to have the authors read because your writing is so good. I may have to hold your microphone, but I want you to read this paragraph, page 6. It's in the introduction of the book, but it shows your writing, how beautiful it is, and it gives us a flavor of the book.
This book is an investigation of what seduces us to water, despite its dangers, and why we come back to it again and again. It's clear to me that once we can swim for survival, swimming can be so much more. The act of swimming can be one of healing and health, a way to well-being. Swimming together can be a way to find community through a team, a club, or a shared beloved body of water. We have only to watch each other in water to know that it creates space for play. And if we get good enough at the thing, it can be an engine of competition, a way to test our mettle in the pool or open water. Swimming is about the mind, too. To find rhythm in the water is to discover a new way of being in the water, in the world, through flow. This is about our human relationship to water and how immersion can open our imaginations.
Beautiful. So I want to talk about community, and I want to start. Community was both heartwarming and hard to read. But first, tell us about Baghdad.
Okay, so this is another great story. I was thinking about what a swim team did for me growing up, right? It was my tribe. It was the first time I really felt home in my body and found friends that really felt like we really saw each other. And I heard I got a letter again, like this is correspondence kind of figures prominently, I think, in my work because I do think about it as a back and forth. I do think about it as an act of trust when someone tells you a story and then you share it. And uh, Jay Taylor was a Foreign Service guy who was in Baghdad, and he started a swim team there. And it was like basically a
It's
mini.
during the Iraq.
This is during the war, and it was, he would. They had this amazing pool in the green zone. It was so weird, but at first they started swimming at a pool at one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. And so they would let them swim in there. And sometimes he would be swimming and there'd be like an air raid siren going off, and he'd have to jump out of the pool and go hide in a bunker. But then they moved to the whole green zone to another more secure like location where there was this actual like 25 yard pool. Well, actually, I do encourage you all to look up pictures of Saddam's palace in Baghdad because there was this pool and there are all these foreign service folks. It's really wild, like what he built. And anyway, it's all very complicated. But what ended up happening is that there was in this time of war, and it's a hellacious time. It is just like so uncertain. And these people from all across the world coming to try to build something new here, right, in a time of extreme danger. And, obviously we know this experiment was very flawed, but there were really good people trying to do some good, and it was very difficult. But everyone from, like the helicopter pilots to the translators to the support staff, they all ended up kind of gravitating to this pool. A lot of people hadn't learned to swim in their home countries. There were Muslim women, there were people from Madagascar, there were people from Mexico, like just everyone across cultural this cultural range and experience and global scattering had come to this place. And Coach Jay, I call him, he started, he had noticed one day, one of his foreign service buddies, um, Andre from Madagascar, he was just kind of flailing around in the pool, and he was just like, Andre, are you drowning? And he said, No, Coach Jay, I'm swimming. And so he started teaching him lessons. And then Andre started becoming a pretty damn good swimmer. And then they started posting little flyers like, oh, if you want to spend some time swimming, because they knew that there was such relief to be found in the water. Even in time of war, this could be true. And people started coming. Like he had like 200 people coming for his like they had like 4 day a week lessons, and he just like couldn't believe it. And Andre became the assistant coach, and it just was
You included it under the section community. Why? Why is it under community?
because even in a place of war, you would not expect to find this. People have a need to gather. I remember, so I wrote about this in the book, but a really good friend of mine from college, her mom was a combat nurse in Vietnam. And she said all the things that we could find to remind us of normalcy, like gathering for dinner, showing each other pictures of our families. Like she's like, swimming would definitely be one of those things if we could have done it. And always thought about the way she talked about how they clung to all of the things that reminded them that they were human beings.
So you also included in community a discussion about who gets to swim. And so talk about who gets to swim in addition to the evolution of swimming pools in America.
So I'll start by saying that even in that Baghdad swim team, that was actually a pretty good illustration of like who gets to swim because it was basically across all of these places, even if these people grew up with access to water or near water on a coastline, they didn't necessarily ever learn to swim because really it boiled down to were you privileged enough? Did you have money and leisure time to have access to a teacher, access to a pool, a parent or a caregiver who could bring you to the place to teach you how to swim? Um, and it was always about money. It was always about class. Um, and and then kind of turning towards the history of pools in this country. And it's interesting to be in. I remember I did a story, a reporting trip to Palm Springs, kind of learning about all these pools here, where you fly and you see all these little squiggles, and it's like how it came up, how it was developed, and who was allowed to be in those pools. And the race component in this country, the barriers to entry, segregation, it was all like very much those effects are still felt today. And it is, I thought it was important to kind of throw or sort of peel back the layers on the question of who gets to swim and why some people don't learn to swim, and show that it is institutionalized, kind of baked into a lot of, as many things are, into how this country, has been for since the beginning.
One story you talked about was even that African Americans could swim on a single day and then they'd empty the pool and fill it the next day. Talk about that a little.
I mean, there's all kinds of crazy race fears, right? Fears of racial mixing, and also, it was interesting because like way back, when public pools were like public bathing facilities, that was actually intended for um, people of the the poorer classes, working class, to kind of come. It was like a hygiene issue. So it's like everyone come, but it was segregated by gender. So like women would have some days and men would have other days. And it was not actually so much of the race anxiety or like where you came from as like class anxiety. And then that started to change when pools became places of recreation in this country where, you'd bring your families. And then it was also then gender mixing. And then when there was a great discomfort around, people of different races mixing in this way, in this recreational way, in this gender way. And then because public pools were such an amazing resource, like, or I mean, at a certain point in this country, you know, so many communities had public pools, and then those, because of these anxieties that were kind of cultural currents, societal currents at the time, those pools shut down because people with means would go to country clubs, you know, uh, build their own pools in their backyard. You look around Palm Springs, that is absolutely it's written in the landscape, kind of, you can see it.
So one of the most, at least for me, the most meaningful part of the book was when you started to talk about the effect of water. And it wasn't just swimming or being in water, but there's hearing a stream or hearing the ocean. So tell us about some of the research and kind of what you discovered about the effect of water on us, both physically and mentally.
This is actually a really fun part of the book to write about flow, right? So this last section of the book is, I mean, it's about what is it really like? What does it feel like to be in the water? And what does that give us beyond, this physical health? But I'm sorry, the all of these, it's not just about making our bodies stronger. I mean, this is kind of all tied to on muscle as well. Um, it's about all of the benefits that flow from that experience of moving your body and being in water. And we are wired to want to be in the world, want to be in nature, want to be in the water, blue spaces, green spaces. And when we hear water, it does something to our brains. When we get into water, it does something to our brains and our mood. And when we get into cold water, that's a whole other thing. Everyone knows all about this, like rage and mania for cold plunges now. Um, and it's so interesting what happens to your body. We when we put our faces in water, we have the mammalian dive reflex. Like biologically, everything slows down. Heartbeat. We're now in a muffled state of being. It's calm because we are. You put a baby face out in the water. The instinct is to hold their breath. Not forever, but that is something that is evolutionarily baked into our how we how we are physiologically. And there's a slowing down, and then think about taking a big breath. The nature of swimming is to big deep breaths, holding them, letting them out. What is that but meditation? It's moving meditation. And there's a calming effect as you're doing this. Um, and it's like breathing exercises, but it's baked into the whole enterprise. And then, again, with movement and circulation, of course, and then the pressure of the water in your body is really salutary. People talked about taking the water cure before they even knew why. And this is why. The science is catching up. It's really interesting.
I love that you said moving meditation. That's something I say every Saturday. If you want to come to Tai Chi at Sunnyland, 10 o'clock, I teach Tai Chi, but we say that every time we teach is Tai Chi is a moving meditation. I think that's why this section kind of resonated with me and was so meaningful because there is something about it. But it's more than just being in the water. It's sometimes just hearing the water and having a calming effect. Why is that?
Well, your brainwave, I mean, they've done many studies about what happens when you just listening to water. I mean, I think there's a statistic in the book about how many times Spotify, that loop of like soothing ocean sounds, is like, one of the most popular streams on Spotify because people listen to the ocean when they're going to sleep. So it's just this 8-hour loop of the ocean.
So you have this great quote from D.H. Lawrence, the third thing. It says, water is H2O, hydrogen, two parts, oxygen, one. But there is also a third that makes it water, and nobody knows what it is. So I want you to read the next part from there. So
It's in the opening pages of Moby Dick. Yes, as everyone knows, Ishmael declares, meditation and water are wedded forever. Here at the novel's beginning, Ishmael calls our attention to the crowds of dreamy water gazers gathered along the shores of Manhattan on a afternoon. See all those people leaning over ever so far. They prove him right. The ocean's liquid fingers have a way of transfixing us in thought. Ishmael points out that the ancient Persians called the sea holy, that the Greeks give it a powerful deity of its very own. A maiden voyage sings with a kind of mystical vibration. But what exactly is the magic of water and what does it do to us? It's a mystery. When we peer into a lake, river, or ocean, we find that water encourages a particular kind of reverie. Perhaps its depths can enhance our consciousness even more if instead of just looking, we get in and swim. We jump into that water and find ourselves in a curious liminal space. Here we are, suspended, yet moving, floating, yet ever in danger of sinking. And if we swim with the current instead of fighting against it, we find a momentary state, one of motion and yet paradoxical stillness that is flow.
did you do the audible for the book?
I did it.
You should have, because it's kind of mesmerizing to hear her talk about it. It's like swimming, the effect of
I
swimming.
did. I did read. I did do the audiobook for On Muscle though.
So tell us about why you included competition as one of the subjects.
Well, I think it was obvious because it is how many of us come to swimming as kids on the swim team, and um, so there is a draw, right? Sports. Um, but you know, I think why people feel, I mean, it's kind of like why do people run? I mean, like why do they want like going fast, right? Going fast is the measure by which you take yourself, or how far,
So
right?
when you were in competitive swimming, right? So was that an enjoyable experience or was it work or how did you feel about it when you were in that competitive state?
I loved it when I was a kid. I loved competing when I was a kid. I loved racing. I loved going fast. But I kind of hate it as an adult. And I think it's because, when you're a kid, competition is a motivation. It's fun to kind of race your friends, and that's how many of us parents get our kids to do anything. And and then I think as you get older, that is less of, well, at least for me, I think it was interesting to join a swim team for this book as an adult. I joined a master's team because I wanted to see what it felt like. I wanted to see, did it feel the same? Did I hate it? I kind of hated it, but it was so familiar to me. And I joined a swim team when my older son, at the time he was 6, and he had joined his first swim team. So we were doing it together, and he's like shivering on the block, and I'm just like, I see myself there. And then when I would go to a meet, it was so familiar to me. But I think you know, I spent a long time, I spent about 10 years of my life after college, like trying to deprogram myself from having competition or having to have a coach tell me what to do when I was swimming so that I can really just enjoy it. And I'm so happy with where I am now with swimming. Like, swimming over the course of my life, it plays different roles. It's a different friend to me, I guess. And now it's one that kind of supports me through, I mean, I've been like, I'm showing my age, but I've been rehabbing this like compressed nerve, and the only thing right now that feels makes me feel great is swimming, but I'm so grateful that it's still my friend, after all these years.
It's interesting you say that because I really didn't take up lap swimming till my back told me I was done with tennis. Kind of the same thing, a compressed nerve or something, whatever they said it was. But I could swim.
Yeah.
It didn't, it relieved that. So I want to ask you one more question about competitive swimming because I thought it was so interesting. You say in the book, competitive swimming is like swim like a dolphin. And I've never done competitive swimming, so I didn't understand what this meant, but swim like a dolphin, think like a seal.
Oh. That was there's a famous sports psychologist who worked with the Olympians, Bob, I think it's Bob. Oh my God, no. Sorry, I'm forgetting all the people in my book. Also showing my age. But he talked about the Navy SEAL mindset. We were talking about Katie Ledecky, who is just the greatest swimmer of all time. But you know, she would do the thing, and Michael Phelps too, like do the thing enough so that it was like autopilot, so when the race comes, but you're thinking about, like, you just kind of like go blank because your body has been trained so intensely for this thing that you have to kind of forget about all the things that you were thinking about, all the chatter in your head, so that when you do it, you do the job.
So I want to end with another reading because your writing is so good. And I think people will appreciate this because of one sentence. Uh, read this last part of the book.
On a flight to Palm Springs, I see the geometry of pool-centric living clearly laid out below in the repeating grid of turquoise rectangles, ovals, and odd little squiggles.
And we've all been there as we fly in.
Pools, actually, when I flew in this week, I was looking for the squiggles. Pools can be anywhere and are especially necessary in a landlocked locale. Enter and you may go anywhere in your thoughts. Enter in the specific geography of Southern California, for example, and you gain insight into the American optimism of the post-World War II era. This is where Hollywood once went to get away, where people found escape by diving in. The very idea of these sapphire pools as escape infiltrated the iconography of American film and literature. Or take a dip in a hot pool in Iceland in the dead of winter, and you'll see through a crack, the delicious warmth reviving you to the nocturnal pleasures of the once forbidding dark. We have put pools in places. We have put pools in places where they are necessary for surviving the pressures of modern life. Pools are a symbol. It is possible to emerge from the water reinvented, a new version of yourself. In a typical pool, the distance between the diving board and the ladder is 20 feet, maybe, but so much more separates the two. In that space, we might catch a glimpse of what we desire. I remember the summer Felix jumped off a diving board for the first time. As he stood there on the plank gathering courage, I saw an ocean of possibility open up in the space that separated his tiny, dripping body from the water below. He sprang toward the ladder at the side of the diving tank, and I saw myself reflected in the water, in him, as he took flight, arms outstretched, suspended there for one glorious moment. What did I want for him? What did I wish for him? An elemental understanding of water, of how it can be a portal to somewhere else. He hit the water with a muted, backlit splash. When he bobbed up to the surface, he paused, just for a heartbeat. Then he began to swim.
So we have just 1 minute left. And tell us about the impact of this book because I saw it just before the session started where someone came up to you and told you how much this book meant to them, their community. So have you heard that from others?
Yes, and that's like the renewing gift of this book, um, and this experience. And it just means the world to me. And I'm so glad that it has a life of its own. It's swimming out there in the world, like all by itself. And it is always funny, like every book is like that, right? You make it, you create it, and then you send it out into the world and you don't know what's gonna happen. And will it come back and visit? And it comes back to visit all the time. And I love that. And I'm so grateful. So thank you.
So you should be proud because it's nice the book isn't about how we swim, but it's why we swim. It's wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Deb.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sonia Purnell with Mary Louise Oates.
Just a signal. Just
Oh, I think
right. Good morning. Good morning. Ignore it. I do. Uh, very pleased to be here today to talk about women. A little sex, but not much. Mostly politics, and with a fabulous writer. Many people here I know have already read Kingmaker, and I'm certainly going to focus on that. But I'd like to start by having Sonia talk about these three remarkable women and what brought them out.
Well, my very first book, which didn't come out in the States, was about Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain. I'd had the misfortune of working with him, and so I knew what he was like. But after that, I was very keen to write about people that I could admire and learn from and be inspired by. And just sort of, I cast my net quite wide. I was reading all sorts of things, and I stumbled across a letter from Clementine Churchill. I have to confess at this point, I'd never thought about Winston Churchill having a wife. I mean, it just didn't really occur to me when you learned about Winston Churchill at school in Britain. No one mentioned her. And I once did this thing where I held up a picture of her and I asked 21 people of different ages and backgrounds, who is this woman? Only one of them got it right. They came up with lots of things. So she had disappeared from history, but I stumbled across this letter that she sent Winston Churchill in 1940, her husband. And yes, it's weird that it was a letter because they lived in the same building, but they often wrote to each other and send a servant down the corridor with the letter, different times. Very good for biographers, though. And this letter to Winston Churchill, really, at the time of the maximum peril to Britain, we thought we were about to be invaded. He'd just become Prime Minister. And guess what? He was being rather grumpy and sharp with his staff. One of them, we don't know who, although there are lots of guesses about this, went to see Clementine, always knowing she was a sort of higher authority in a way, and said, this is not good because actually in wartime, in this kind of peril, we don't want to be scared of the boss. You know, people want to be able to go to him with ideas and for them to get a good reaction. So she wrote a letter to him. She ripped up twice, wrote a letter to him, really basically instructed him to be his best self, calm, kind. He had enormous powers now, but he was not to use them in a harsh way, not to create a hostile atmosphere, because that simply wasn't going to work in such a crisis. And then I looked at his entourage, the memoirs, letters of the time, and it was really interesting because there's no response to that letter from Winston, but the entourage would say things like, the Prime Minister's bad-tempered phase was a passing one, or the Prime Minister barked at me again tonight, but then put his arm around me and said, I don't mean to be fierce to anyone except that man in Berlin. And it was quite clear from this that she had an immense power that had never been written about or recognised, certainly not in modern times. So that started a whole process, really, of finding out about her role. And it turns out that those speeches that we all know. She wrote bits of them. She edited them. She rehearsed them. She got them changed when she thought they needed to be changed. She dealt with the cabinet a lot. She set up something called the Aid to Russia Fund when Britain was scared that the alliance with Joe Stalin, always a difficult thing to manage, was cracking, and that needed to be shored up. And she set up this Aid to Russia Fund off her own back to try and get Anglo-Soviet relations back on track. It worked so well, by the way. This was never written about before. Stalin himself invited her by herself to the Kremlin in the spring of 1945 to give her an award and a pension for the rest of her life from the Soviet Union. So this was something she'd done off her own back. No one else had been to the Kremlin. Imagine any of the leaders' wives at the moment going to see Putin in the Kremlin and sorting stuff out, you know. And so I kind of realized that this was a story that really deserved to be told and hadn't been told. And one of the things I found was that meeting with Stalin, one of many things that she did. We know about it because her translator, a man called Hugh Lungi, was interviewed before he died by some archives in Britain at Churchill College, Cambridge, and he talked about the meeting in Stalin's study. And you know what? No one else had ever listened to that tape, ever. When I discovered it, I thought, oh, this is great. Has this ever, when was the last time this was taken out? And they can look and see it's never been taken out. So after 17 and the story that came out of that, and by the way, Gil Wynant, the American ambassador to Britain at the time, wrote after the war, this is a bit of a rallying call for me, if the future breeds historians of understanding, then one day Clementine Churchill will get her due. Well, it was kind of, come on, Sonia, you got to do it. So I did. But after that, I realized, I thought we knew everything we needed to know about the Second World War. I was so wrong because there were other women who did extraordinary things. War is a terrible, terrible thing. But the extraordinary thing, too, is that it gives people who wouldn't normally have the chance to do great things. It just happens that a lot of those people are women because their opportunities, their horizons are so much narrower in peacetime. So that led on to a woman of no importance, Virginia Hall, who had a wooden leg, who had been dismissed and rejected constantly by the State Department, dismissed as a woman of no importance, but who then went on to fan the flames of the French resistance, to really help change the course of the fighting in France, who very much was responsible, or in large part anyway, of clearing an entire department of France of the Germans before a single professional soldier got there, who has been described by the Gestapo as the most dangerous Allied spy of all. We must find and eliminate her. Most people, until I read the book, and I'd like to think that more people know about her now, had never heard of her. She organized one of the biggest jailbreaks in the Second World War. We've all heard about Colditz and things. All those guys pretty much got caught or killed. Every single man she jumped out of jail survived, every single one, and got back to Britain to fight another day. And then, of course, Pamela Harriman, or Pamela Churchill, she was then Clementine's daughter-in-law, also, I knew, played this extraordinary role, and I'm sure we will talk about that too. So these three women are just three. I'm sure there are hundreds more. Their stories have been overlooked, misinterpreted, rejected by history. Just to give you one last example, there is an 800-page biography of Winston Churchill called The Greatest Briton Unmasked. Clementine Churchill does not appear once in the index. But Churchill himself said in 1948, on the occasion of their 40th wedding anniversary, push a little piece of paper under her bedroom door. They never had the same bedroom, saying, nothing in my life or my work would have been possible without you. So I think I almost feel it's my duty. This is what sort of makes me get out of bed in the morning. I feel I must tell these stories. We need to know them because history as it was incomplete.
So I have a question about the Churchills' relationship to Pamela and the way they used her as a weapon of diplomacy. She was very young. She'd come up at 19 into London. She had a bad coming out year. No one asked her to marry him. And then suddenly Randolph Churchill, the son of Clementine and Winston, kind of a cad and a boor and a drunk and a spendthrift, he was desperate to have a child to carry on the Churchill name. And she was the 8th person, I think I remember correct, the ninth person that he asked to marry him within a 2-week period.
Yep.
And
the others all said no.
And she said, yes, she was not going back to the country life in Dorset. Okay. So then they suddenly realized that she's so attractive. She has her child. She has Winston. Trust me, this name thing gets very confusing when you're reading the book. Which one is this?
Young Winston.
But she has Winston, and they suddenly realize she's really attractive to men. And they play in on the whole thing. She gets to whisper in Ed Murrow's ear. He gets to significantly twist Averil Harriman around and put him in a different direction. He had other lovers at the time, Ali Khan.
Later on, afterward, yeah.
Yes, afterwards. I mean, she worked through a lot of guys. Now, I got to meet her. It was part of my dowry from my husband, Bob Schrum, who had known her for many years. And we got married in '88. I would just like to tell you something. She was lovely to me from day one. Because everybody always said, well, you know, she's cool and aloof and all that. She was really great. How do you feel about the way the Churchills used?
Well, I know it looks dark because this was facilitated, encouraged by the Churchills. She was their daughter-in-law. She was married to their son, and she had what is now called a strategic sex life. And that strategic sex life was, yes, targeting and seducing important and influential Americans. And why was she doing this? Well, if you cast your mind back to 1940, before Pearl Harbor, you guys are not in the war. You don't want to be in the war for very good reasons. But the Brits need to somehow persuade you that the Brits are worth saving and are savable. Because unless that happens, Britain is not going to survive. And it's pretty much the last European country not, run by tyranny, by tyrants. And so that's the most important thing, is to change the hearts and minds of America. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, she posed with some pictures for Life magazine with her baby. And these were splashed all over the front page of Life, and that had a very big impact with readers of Life magazine. But the second phase of what she did was, yes, she was going to seduce these important Americans who Averil Harriman ran the Lend-Lease military aid program. So he was key. He needed to be persuaded to bring the right things that Britain really needed. So whatever that was, whether it was food or bits of metal or ships or planes, whatever it was, he had to be persuaded to bring the right things at the right time. He was sent over by Roosevelt because he was seen to be an aloof, cold person, surely not susceptible to any of those Churchillian charms, but actually he was completely susceptible. And as he says, the Blitz got things going pretty quickly, and the Blitz got things going very quickly indeed with Pamela. And by the time he went back to DC a few months later, they all said, have you been bewitched? You seem unduly pro-British now. This was working extremely well. And she continued, as Otzi says, with Ed Murrow's boss, Bill Paley, a general here, admiral there, and all the rest of it. This does sound dark, right? She was a 21, 22-year-old woman. But two things I would say that to you. It was desperate. Desperate times need desperate measures. And America was the shining city on the hill, if you like to use a phrase. The second thing was she was totally willing. She was incredibly close to both Churchills, both Winston and Clementine. She was in the closest possible inner circle that was conducting a world war. She knew exactly what was needed and what she was good at, which was attracting older, powerful men who fell for her like ninepins. It's just extraordinary. Read Chips Channon's diaries about the effect that she had on men. And so the Churchills had noticed this. She noticed this about herself. But that wasn't the only thing. She was also had a really good brain. She was very good at absorbing details and facts, understanding which ones were important, and then passing them back to Churchill. Think of Zelensky for a minute as a supplicant to the White House. That was the position that Churchill was in. Churchill did it rather better, you could argue, because he did his homework on what was likely to go down well in the Oval Office. Where did some of that homework come from? Where did the real gems of that homework come from? It was information passed by Pamela from Averell Harriman and other key Americans in London back to Churchill. So he knew what to say and how to say it to Roosevelt. So this does sound bad, doesn't it? And maybe you're thinking, hang on a minute, so she was spying on us? Well, in a sense she was, but I wouldn't quite put it that way because I think spying suggests a hostile motive. This was the reverse of being hostile. This was an idea of we need the Anglo-American alliance to work. You've got all that colonial history, all those resentments and disgruntlements and all the rest of it. They need to be put behind us in history because now the world has changed and this is the biggest crisis the world has ever known. So we need that alliance to work. And this was her part of doing that. And it's interesting that now American professors of diplomacy talk about her strategic sex life and indeed how it helped to create and sustain and elevate what became known as the Special Alliance. Or put it another way, the special relationship, forgive me. Put it another way, the special relationship was born between the sheets of the Dorchester Hotel, which is where she seduced Averell Harriman the first night. So it is dark in a way, but those were very, very dark times. And I do want to emphasize very, very much indeed, she was willing to do it. She did not go to bed with anyone she did not want to go to bed with. She really fancied Averell Harriman. When he arrived, she thought him the sexiest man she'd ever seen. So there were kind of, perks to this job, if I can put it that way. She enjoyed it, but it was super stressful. Soon she was sleeping with several of these important Americans at the same time. We couldn't have a scandal. We couldn't have them fighting or getting jealous. Ed Murray did get a bit jealous at one point, but she handled it. She had to handle that information, obviously not be too obvious in what she was doing, make everyone feel happy and relaxed. She had lots of dinner parties at her apartment, number 49 Grosvenor Square. Next time you're in London, go and have a look. And so there was never any scandal. She handled those big egos, those insecurities. She was 21, 22, 23, 24. I don't know what you were like in your early 20s, but the thought of me trying to kind of handle that is, she was amazing. That woman really had chutzpah.
I think her beauty, which you can see in the photos in this book and online, is sometimes not truly appreciated. Now, this is for the women in the room. She went shopping when she came to see us in LA. Wanted to go to Neiman Marcus. It was 1988. I had never bought anything in Marcus. I was a reporter, but I knew the people who ran it. So we had this big dressing room, and without a moment's hesitation, she stripped. She had a very modest bra and pantyhose, and she had the body of somebody 20 years old. I mean, all that horseback riding, all that swimming, all that athletic stuff really did her very, very well. And there was something about her. She also liked women. She could be very warm and very friendly. She could also cut you cold. Do not misbehave around her. Do not sound too much like a Republican. Do not sound too much like you want to take on any of her ideas. Now, if you look at this book that I have read, these are all my notes, right? I want to find the right one. I think that was it. Okay. During 1965, Gloria Steinem, a vocal and charismatic founder of the women's movement, I'd agree with that, was one of the show's writers of This Is the Week That Was. She and Pamela became friends and lunched together, as Steinem put it, to trade stories of respective worlds. Even though Pamela still claimed she was not like the feminist, I think they've done their own cause enormous harm, she would later say, of the symbolic burning of bras. Well, what do you feel about it?
Well, I think Pamela went on a journey. She was of a class and a generation who were brought up to think a certain way about women, and a class and a generation where those women had no power, really. What interested Pamela most was power, and the people who had power, who happened to be men pretty much exclusively. So I think for a long time, she was not that interested in women unless they were doing sort of what were considered male jobs. So Martha Gellhorn, for example, she was friends with other female war correspondents too, because they were doing things that she was interested in. What she most dreaded was being sort of corralled off to talk about traditional feminine concepts and ideas and subjects. And so I think that made her seem almost anti-feminist for a long time. But I think that journey is also very much true. And as she became more and more of a figure herself in the United States and in the Democratic Party, I think her ideas changed very much. And towards the end of her life, of course, she was the American ambassador in Paris, where she discovered that her deputy chief of mission, one Avis Boland, was going to be a woman. Now, the Washington Post ran a story saying that Pamela was totally against this and actually wanted a man. Now, I've asked Avis Boland about this, and she said, yeah, there might have been something in that. I don't know. But anyway, Pamela phoned her up immediately and said, this is all nonsense, of course. And then what happened was that she arrived, she discovered her number 2, number 3, and number 4, coincidentally, this had never happened before in such a major American embassy, were all women. And Pamela very openly said, okay, right now I see how good women are. And actually, quite often better than the men. And so I think that was part of her education as she got out and as society changed, as women were taking on these roles. After all, she was the first female American ambassador in Paris. And that was such a novel idea that no one knew whether to call her Madame l'Ambassadeur, Madame Ambassador, or Madame l'Ambassadrice, which was the feminine version of that word, but normally, or had always hitherto, applied to the wife of the ambassador. And she was asked this, and she said absolutely, rigidly, I am Madame l'Ambassadeur, and don't forget it. And so I think, you know, in a sense, almost by default, she became a feminist towards the end of her life. And I remember one of the interviews with her, someone asked her, you know, about her granddaughter who was a barrister, you know, would you have liked to do something like that if you had had the chance? Would I? She said, would I? I think that idea that women were men's equals simply hadn't occurred to her early on, and it was life that taught her the reality. And then, in fact, which is a really wonderful thing, is that when she was ambassador, she did become a champion of young, promising, interesting women who were up and coming, and she would hold events for them, one of whom was Christine Lagarde, now head of the World Bank. So she became someone who was a champion of women, who had once been dismissed as someone who disliked women. She went on a journey, she was open about it, but she certainly changed, I think, over time.
I think that once she had married Averill and moved to DC, she became such a force in electoral politics and basically decided that Bill Clinton would be the next president. And he was, of course, charmed by her. Why not? Going to help make him the president, right? And she really pushed him over a lot of barriers and through a lot of tunnels. I mean, she got him there. Now she's married to Averill, and he's rich. And he has bad money management, right?
Very bad.
So she's dealing both with the political life, and she pays no attention to money. And what happens?
Well, that great Harriman fortune starts off this big and ends up pretty much that big. There were times when she was ambassador that she thought she might be facing bankruptcy, which is a bit of a distraction when you're, extremely busy. Let me just give you an idea about being an ambassador for a second. I talked to a lot of ambassadors when I was writing the book, and what is it like, what happens, and things. I found actually a letter in her collection, the Library of Congress, from a British ambassador in Washington. He did become ambassador in the end, but he had thought of turning it down, this plum job, the job that every British diplomat wants more than anything else, because his wife had died. He didn't think he could do it on his own, and he didn't, in fact, take it till he remarried. So there she was in Paris on her own with all of this stuff going on. She'd fallen out with her stepchildren. There are lawsuits all over the place. The money is disappearing. American ambassadors, political appointees have to spend a lot of their own money on all the sort of social life, if you like, the entertaining. And everyone expected Pamela to do better entertaining than anyone else ever. So this had to be at a very, very high level. So the money was really gushing out, and that was extremely difficult for her, because she wasn't even just a normal ambassador. Again, I spoke to people who were ambassadors in Paris around the same time. No other ambassador, they were all rather jealous, would be called up by President Chirac of France and invited on their own to the Élysée Palace for one-to-one talks. This doesn't happen. He was ambassador plus, plus, plus. Why was he so keen to talk to her? Well, he knew that if she phoned the White House, and Bill Clinton would pick up the phone because they were that close. But he wanted specifically to talk to her about Bosnia, the war in Europe, the first time really that so much blood had been shed on European soil since the Second World War. And he saw Pamela really as the way forward to creating a Western alliance, a Franco-American alliance particularly, that might be able to do something about it. And indeed, she played a huge part in that, again, more than any normal ambassador would do. Chirac is no longer with us, but I spoke to his chief foreign affairs advisor, who was very close to him, and I said, how big a part did Pamela play in this? And he said, oh, her role was invisible but decisive. So it's interesting, she's in her 70s at this point. It's her first formal job. She's never had a job really before, with a salary and everything that goes with it. She had a lot of self-doubt about it. I found some correspondence between her and Jackie Kennedy, or Jackie Onassis, as she was by now, saying, I hope I can do this. She had no university education, no high school education. Her spelling had once been terrible, her maths even worse. She was up against people with strings of degrees from all the fanciest schools. And so there was a real sense of self-doubt, but that drove her to do more homework and more preparation and find more ways around problems than pretty much anyone else. So it's almost like her background, and most particularly her time with Churchill in Downing Street, was this long apprentice for the job she had at the end of her life.
She had a wonderful assistant, in my eyes, wonderful, Janet Howard, who had been with her for many, many years, who was from Texas, and she was a little brusque, but she was devoted to Pamela. And people really tried to separate them out, and they eventually did. And when Pamela died, there was no money left, Janet, nothing. She left the money to everybody in her circle, her family, everyone. And Janet came back to Washington, had to really hustle a job. It was the only moment of betrayal that I ever saw by Pam.
But do you know what? Janet hadn't really spoken about this before, and I'm afraid we've now lost her.
Yep.
But before she died, she was already frail by this point. She agreed to meet me for lunch. We met at the Metropolitan Club in DC. I was expecting her to be rather bitter about Pamela. Not a bit of it. And do you know why? Well, one of the reasons why, she was so devoted. Pamela had made her life exciting and purposeful. But also, and this is really quite sad, Pamela died while swimming in the Ritz Hotel. She's had a headache some days. she was under immense stress. But before she went for that very last swim at the Ritz, she had left a message for Janet on her answer phone saying, I'm going to find a way to give you some money now. Let's speak tonight. Of course, they never did. And Janet told me about that. I could see how affected Janet was, that she had given her life to Pamela. So I said, are you bitter? Don't you resent this? And she said, no, not at all. I knew she would make it right for me in the end. And it's just sad that didn't happen. But she was an extraordinary person to talk to. I mean, they were so close that Janet was allowed to sign documents on her behalf. She could be very brusque. Some of the other staff were not terribly fond of Janet, I think it's fair to say. But she was an extraordinary woman too, I think.
Oh, I thought so too. I think her kitchen cabinet, Holbrook, Berger, my husband Bob Schrum, and the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, were really an impressive group of men and who really respected her greatly. On the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Bob and I and my son Michael, who was then 18, he was finishing his first year at Brown, went to Thanksgiving brunch. Pamela adored him. And she said, oh, Holbrook couldn't wait to talk. You know, he was going to tell us everything we needed to know about the world. Okay, fine, I'm open. Pamela turns to Michael and says, Michael, we're also anxious to hear about your first semester at Brown. Could you tell us about your classes? Oh, he couldn't believe it. He talked for 25 minutes. I thought Holbrook was going to have a fit. He decided how she was going to do things. She didn't care what the expectations were. And she was always very kind. Very kind to me, very kind to my son, adored my husband. Why did she not get better service from her financial advisor?
I think because they weren't very good. And I think
true.
they realized that her eye was off the ball that they were playing, and maybe they thought they didn't have to bother. But a lot of money was lost. But it's interesting, she could have got herself out of this hole. She had still one very valuable painting by Van Gogh, White Roses. Now, if you want to go and see it, it's at the National Gallery in DC. And it's there because Averill had always stated his intention, his desire that that would be where that painting would go. As people said, she could have broken that understanding. It wasn't written in blood. You know, there was no kind of comeback. But she always said, no, that's what's going to happen. And so she was quite honourable about that because it was worth something like $60 million or something, you know, and back then that was even more money. But she didn't. So she got herself in real financial straits. It was pretty bad and obviously really played on her mind. And those close to her seem very much of the opinion that it was ultimately the stress of that. I mean, you know, when families fall out over money, it really is terribly distressing, and that the stress of that certainly contributed to her death at 76, because she seems otherwise so fit, like you say. And actually, I must tell you that, you know, talking about having an incredible body, when she met her second husband, Leland Hayward, who was a Broadway producer, he was the man who brought the world the sound of music. Unfortunately, he didn't really have many hits after that. So all the money that she had went into that marriage and pretty much disappeared. But when they met for the first time, he remembered, well, he thought it the first time, but he remembered that they'd met before on a yacht when she was with Gianni Agnelli, a former lover of hers. And he had never forgotten, although she had forgotten this incident completely, he had never forgotten because it was a beautiful yacht. They were cruising, I think, through the Mediterranean. Everyone was wearing the sort of clothes that you wear on a beautiful yacht, cruising through the Mediterranean. And she came up on deck in absolutely nothing except a very fine diamond necklace. This is not the sort of thing that you forget. So when they met, supposedly for the first time, he said, actually, we have met before. I remember it distinctly. So she knew how to catch a man's eye. I think it's fair to say.
And Nellie came and visited her all the time in Washington. It was very secretive, very secretive. Occasionally, Janet would say to me on the phone, "The Italians here again." But I think that was a deep relation.
Oh yes.
I mean, he wanted to marry her. He
Mm.
became sick when they were much younger. And when she had to go back to England, the sisters moved in and introduced him to, I'm going to say her name correctly, Marisa. Thank you, Bob. Marisa, who had this one of Mogliani neck, very Italian in a painting, you know. And he never forgot Pamela.
Oh, that's true. So, I mean, he was very much an Italian man in the 1950s, and Pamela said she didn't want to marry someone where there'd always be starlets popping out of every wardrobe. I mean, he could give her everything except fidelity. She had helped him rehabilitate himself. He'd fought on the wrong side of the war. He was Italian. Fiat had prospered hugely by supplying trucks and tanks to Hitler and Mussolini. To say this was an embarrassment is an understatement of, you know, some magnitude. But he was desperate to restore Fiat's fortunes because he saw that Italy's fortunes very much relied on Fiat coming back. And there was a time when the Americans were quite keen to confiscate Fiat altogether from the Agnelli family, and he was desperate to stop that happening. And Pamela was really useful on this because she explained how you could tell the people who were going to make this decision make the argument that actually I'm the bulwark against communism in Italy, which was considered a really likely event that the communists would take over, particularly in the 1948 elections. So initially, Churchill would not meet him. He said, I don't want to meet that ghastly Italian car mechanic that you're running around with. But eventually, because Pamela was super persuasive, he arranges a dinner party with Agnelli and Churchill, and they meet. And then I'm pretty certain she also introduced him to JFK. Certainly, the Kennedy family came to know him very well, and he became great friends with JFK a bit later on. She tutors him. She says, this is how international statesmen behave. This is how they talk, how they dress. And she tutored him and all that. She'd seen all these statesmen and how they behaved. And here was this young man about the same age as her. And it's interesting, someone like Henry Kissinger, you know, later on would describe Agnelli not as an industrialist, but as a statesman. And Agnelli was super grateful and showed his gratitude with the purchase of a really knockout, gorgeous apartment in Paris, a custom-made Bentley, a butler, accounts at all the couturiers, and all the rest of it. But this is also, actually, I believe, however transactional I've just described it, a real love. And in the end, she decided that, no, I'm not going to marry you, Gianni, because I know what life would be like. He says, we split up, but we never parted. Now, Agnelli had always had money. He'd always had women chasing him. He had what you would call a soccer team. He had every car, every yacht. He had everything. He tired of everyone and everything except Pamela. And as Janet told me, Janet Howard, her assistant, he called her every single day for the rest of her life. And as she said, you know, we split up, but we never parted. And Otzi was saying, you know, how he would come and see her in Paris when she was ambassador. And Janet told me that, oh, when Agnelli was coming, she took twice as long to get ready for the evening as for anyone else. And I would have to have a drink with him first and keep him chatting while she was upstairs getting ready. There was still this immense frisson between them, you know, forever, really. And there was actually one occasion when Agnelli came to the Georgetown house and Avril was still alive. And one of Pamela's staff told me her job that morning was to make sure that Avril was kept to one side of the house so that she could see Agnelli. Now, I don't know what they got up to or what the thinking was behind that, but Agnelli never left her life or her love, I believe. He was the great love of her life. I think she was immensely fond of Harriman. I think she really loved him, really loved Avril. But I think she was always in love with Gianni. And in a way, maybe right at the end, both of them regretted they hadn't got married. But then you wouldn't have had Clinton because, you know, as Bill Clinton told me, he really did help him get to the White House. And in her papers at the Library of Congress is a handwritten letter from him to her just after the victory, before the inauguration, which said, "I would never have been ready to stand before America and the world as president without you." When we chatted, I chatted to him, fantastic chat. He's immensely easy to talk to. He said, "Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, she got me into the White House." And in the eulogy he gave at her funeral, which is on YouTube, if you're interested, it's a great, very emotional, very kind of heart-wrenching eulogy. He says, "I am here today in no small part because she was there." So this woman shaped your politics just as she helped shape the British effort during the World War. That is 50 years apart on two continents, that close to the centre of power. I'm not sure there's anyone else who can kind of claim that crown, really.
I think that's true. When we were at the embassy in Paris, which was pretty swanky, really, there were two staff people. There was a kind of butler major domo, and there was a personal maid. And they were both Italian. And the day after she died, they disappeared. So my smart husband figured out that they had been a gift from Johnny and had come and taken care of her. So it was, people felt a deep involvement with it. It wasn't just a superficial thing. She's a pretty smart woman. It had significant outcome on our electoral process.
She did. I mean, it's one of the ways, you know, in the 92 campaign was that she talked about Churchill, for instance, and why he'd lost the election at the end of the war in 1945, and that was because he kept on banging on about the war as everyone wanted to move on. They wanted to talk about housing and health and their kids, and she saw that there was a parallel with the 92 campaign, Bush having huge approval ratings, but actually wages were under pressure, people were suffering at home, and this idea eventually became, you know, is the economy stupid? And she was very much involved in that conversation. She was the one who brought up Churchill's plight. It's interesting, actually, someone else who wanted her to talk to them about Churchill's plight was Nixon, because he, as you know, as we now know from the papers that have come out, was worried that the Vietnam War would end at the wrong moment, and this would affect his, you know, electoral chances. And I found some papers in his collection where he's telling his staff, "Can you get Pamela in for dinner? I need to talk to her about this." So I don't know what happened at the dinner, whether it took place, but there are 2 or 3 mentions of it in his private papers. And so it's interesting that, I mean, so many presidents wanted her help. I mean, that includes JFK, whose life she saved, by the way, who found out how in the book. Nelson Mandela wanted her help. She was very close to Biden. She was close to Chirac in France. She was obviously close to Winston Churchill. I mean, who else has all these people kind of really wanting your company, but also your counsel? It is really quite extraordinary. And you know, Nelson Mandela, how I found out about that was I looked at the Sotheby's catalogue for her sale when she died, or the sale of all her effects. And her family crest had an ostrich in it. She was very proud of this. And in that catalogue, you'll see that there is a rather beautiful painting of 3 ostriches. Oh, that's interesting. Underneath, it says, "A gift from President Nelson Mandela of South Africa." And I was wondering, why on earth is he giving her paintings? How does he know that about the ostrich and her family crest? And then in her papers, I discovered transcripts and letters and other things about how before the first multiracial elections in South Africa, he was terrified that the ANC were going to lose. Why? They had no money, no infrastructure, no real policies beyond obviously multiracial elections. They didn't know how to be that sort of political party. It never occurred to them before. Who could they call? Who might be able to advise them? Pamela. So there's a transcript, this phone call coming in from South Africa. "Can you help me? I'm coming over to Bill Clinton's inauguration. Can we meet?" And so that is what happened. He helped him. She got this group of people together, very high profile, high caliber people. He's so grateful. He sends her that painting as thanks.
We are out of time. I urge you to buy and read this book. You just have to get your Post-its to put them in there so you can do the pieces you like the best. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Gaines with Linda Fairstein.
Hello.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I hope you've enjoyed the festival, which just gets better and better every year and brings in more and more interesting people. I didn't meet Stephen until a minute of time yesterday, but I have admired a book that isn't even mentioned in this book, which I'm going to ask him to talk about. And I was just thoroughly engaged, entranced, and admiring of this book.
Thank you.
Your writing is superb. You really are a stylist. You have a great way for words. It's so immediate. I mean, you hold nothing back and you take us into a world. You and I were both in New York in the 70s. Very different lives and lifestyles, but you brought it all back and all to a very immediate sense. And again, your writing style, I admire enormously.
Thank you. Very
So
nice.
why don't you start by telling us, this is not your first rodeo, it's not your first book.
Right.
Take us through, well, there's a book before this that is with the same press,
Right.
right?
Delphinium, yes. So this book, The Greta Garbo Home for Wayward Boys and Girls, is the second part of a book called One of These Things First. One of These Things First is told through the voice of a 15-year-old, and then we leap ahead 10, 15 years to see what's happened to that sweet boy who was so lost and in the middle of the craziness of New York in the 70s. And so this is a companion piece to the first one, and this explains where he went to, what he became of him, and his loves and dissatisfaction with life. By the way, I never talk about these books. I'm not doing it purposely when I say I never talk, but somehow I never say me, I. I always talk about the boy in the book, and I don't know what that is, how that comes about, but it is. So obviously, I have some sense of separation, and that probably helped me write the book the way it is, because I think if I was writing I in every sentence, I'd get self-conscious, or I'm not exactly sure what it would be. So if you hear me say the boy, you'll know it's me.
Okay. It's a really good point of separating it from becoming so self-conscious in a memoir.
Yes.
Uh,
Considering the revelations that I make about myself,
oh, yes.
I would, self-conscious isn't the word.
Okay, go beyond that. So, would you be good enough to tell us what you were experiencing at 15? The title of our talk is Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll. I can hold my own on sex. I can hold my own on rock and roll. Can't do it on drugs, but maybe we start with sex and
With the first
sexuality.
book?
Well, you can, yes, because they lead in, and then
Okay, so when I grew up above my grandmother's bra and girdle store, which made me gay. It's a scientific fact. If you have any children, do not let them grow up in a bra and girdle store. You see things that will definitely turn you gay. This is in the 1950s, and there were no gyms, so people weren't very much in shape. And I used to rip open the curtain to the dressing room when I was 6 years old or 7 years old, like this, to see, and it was pretty hard. It wasn't good. And they would
wasn't
yell at
pretty.
me, and they would spank me, and then I would still go back and do it. So when when I when I realized that I had feelings for other boys, I was horrified. It was there was no gay, there was nothing to help. I lived in a shtetl in Brooklyn called Bensonhurst. There was no one to turn to. I couldn't go to my dad, my grandfather. There wasn't a doctor. I didn't know to go to a doctor. I didn't know what to do, so I had to keep this secret to myself. And finally, it got so painful that I tried to kill myself, which a lot of gay people are still doing who don't know where to turn and get help. So I made a very, very serious suicide attempt, and they were going to put me into a state mental institution because I refused to tell them why I did it. I was still too ashamed to say that I had feelings for boys. There was the gay word didn't exist as far as I knew back then. So through some magic piece of luck. I saw the night before I was going to be committed, I saw Marilyn Monroe on TV, and she was coming out of a very exclusive psychiatric clinic called Payne Whitney. So immediately decided I wanted to be in the clinic where Marilyn Monroe went. So, and I talked them into it, talked my grandfather, who owned the Bra and Girdle store, because it was private. It was a lot of money to go there. And he said he'll pay for 4 months or 5 months of me to be in Payne Whitney. So most of the book takes place in Payne Whitney. And just was remarkable. It was wonderful. Actually, it was kind of wonderful like this. Great, interesting people. You know, it was not like being locked up in an asylum. It was very, very different. My best friend, I befriended. I was so lucky that he took me under his wing. Was a man named Richard Halliday. He was married to Mary Martin, and Richard Halliday produced South Pacific, and I just could go on. The Sound of Music. He was a Broadway producer. He wouldn't say why he was there, but he became. Well, we were all locked together on a floor, and so I met him. There was a woman who said she had been President Kennedy's mistress. We said, "Oh, she's really crazy." Turns out, she was one of them. And there was a lady who her family owned a bank in Vermont, and there were all different kinds of people who interacted. One of the things they did, what they said to me was, "You dress terribly." And I said, "Well, I live on 18th Avenue in Brooklyn, and this is what." And they said, "No, ask your parents to buy you a pair of Bass Weejuns." And that's literally how it started. And then somebody said, "No, you should wear this, and you should do." I guess I didn't follow the lessons completely, but
Good jacket.
they turned me into a different. They changed my view of the world, and I knew I could be somebody else. And I told stories to Richard Halliday. And one day, offhandedly, he said, "You tell great stories. You should write." And I said, "Really, really? Do you think I should write?" And he said, "Absolutely." And I got out of the hospital. I was thrilled, and after 4 months, I met all these people. My life was changed. My viewpoint, not necessarily about being gay, but the single most important thing was I finally broke down and told the doctor, Wayne Myers, um, that I had feelings for other boys, and it was a big breakthrough. And this is what he said to me. Um, you don't have to change if you don't want to change. But if you do want to change, I can cure you.
And excuse me, that's the word that was used for homosexuality in the 70s. That you needed a
Absolutely.
cure.
Absolutely. I'm sorry I'm not giving you a chance to ask me
Oh, thank
questions.
God, I'm so sick. I've had this cold. I love hearing you talk.
Okay,
Help me.
so he if you want to do this, you can change. And I said, "Oh, I want it more than anything in the whole world." So he said, "Well, when you get released from the hospital, I will continue to be your therapist. Well, you need full Freudian analysis for this to work. I want to see you a minimum of 4 days a week." My grandfather was preparing the Heron visit. It was very, very expensive. And so he said, what do you do? What do you do? And he said, "Well, you have to sleep with women and not think about men and not sleep with any men. And you have to sleep with a lot of women." And so I thought, oh, maybe heterosexuality is an acquired taste, like scotch. Oh, the more you drink it, the more you like it. And so I did. I became a serial dater. I dated lots of women, and I had sex with lots of women, and it was very confusing to me. I mean, I knew that the woman's body is a beautiful thing, um, but I felt like a Jew in the Vatican. I you know, I knew that the Sistine, ceiling was beautiful, but I just didn't get the resurrection. So, so, but that's by the way not true. Gay men have sex with women all the time, and that's not the problem. But I did that for many many years, and it didn't work. So I decided that I had to give that up. This is who I was going to be, and um, that first book ends with me thanking Dr. Myers because, by the way, Dr. Myers, this is the weirdest thing. I was speaking somewhere, And a woman raised her hand and she said, "Did you read Bruce Springsteen's autobiography?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, he went to this guy, Wayne Myers, and says that Wayne Myers saved his life." So I'm dying to run into Bruce Springsteen somewhere because every time I went there and I laid down on the couch, it was warm. So I'd like to think it was Bruce Springsteen who was there. But and anyway, that's where the book ends with me thanking. The first book ends with me thanking Dr. Myers for all the work he did. He gave me a way of living, a way of being in the world. My sexuality was, he was wonderful to me, as opposed to what was going on at home. So this picks up 10 years later, where I'm out in the world and I'm living in Greenwich Village, and I'm enormously unhappy with what I've found. Um, okay, I finally said, "All right, I'll be gay," and it was a terrible, distorted version of what the world should be like. I didn't like it. This is what was left me. This is what I was gonna go through, and what it was gonna be like. And so the second book, the Greta Garbo Home, is my experiences. By the way, it's very funny, the Greta Garbo Home. So is the first one. It's This sounds, like it might not be a happy book, but it's very funny. I just couldn't help it. And so we're up to the Greta Garbo Home. And by the way, um, there were people in and out, both men and women in and out all the time. The neighbors didn't know what was going on. So I had an interior decorator, and he said that there was a song called "My Name's Jack, and I live in the back of the Greta Garbo Home for Wayward Boys and Girls." So he had a plaque made for me, and I put it on the front door on West 11th Street. It became everybody in the village knew the Greta Garbo Home with this plaque on it and wondered what it was. So that's where the title comes from. It's about that 146 West 11th Street and my adventures in the city.
Which are great and astounding. I have so many dog-eared pages in this book because there's sections I wanted to talk about. I would love you to talk for a bit about uh, the state of psychiatry and homosexuality in the 70s. I'm calling it homosexuality because it was that there's something you refer to called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which is still to this day the handbook for the medical community on psychiatric disorders, and it is for lawyers in courtrooms, how diagnoses are made. Excuse me. And at that point in time, until about 1973,
That's correct, yeah.
homosexuality was a perversion. It was a disease.
That's right.
And the only thing was to try and cure
Right,
people who had it. And then that changed in the 70s.
right.
Would you talk about that while I recover?
Well, so I had spent all this time with Wayne Myers, um, learning self-hatred. He didn't mean it that way, but I was sick. It was a sickness. It said so in the DSM. Um, and so I was filled. I was revolted by the things that I started to do. Not while I was doing it, but after I was, just full of guilt, and I hated it. And then suddenly the DSM in 1973 declared homosexuality was no longer a disease. And you were only sick if you couldn't adjust to it. In other words, gay men who didn't like being gay men, that was the problem, that they didn't like gay men. It wasn't just being gay. And the DSM changing was just an enormous thing. I was still seeing Wayne Myers, kind of veering off towards the end of seeing Wayne Myers, but I had a whole new life. Um, and so that's the big change that happened to me when it became legal. It became not a disease.
And so I have a friend who saw a very brilliant, prominent psychiatrist in New York briefly, and they became friends. And this doctor wrote a seminal paper in 1978, Richard Friedman. Until then, psychiatrists were not, even if they were gay, were not allowed to be openly gay and practicing psychiatry according to the AMA. That's how cruel.
I
and ordered.
remember something like that. Psychiatrists, if they were gay, they couldn't say so. I really, I was working for an auction gallery. I mean, I went to NYU Film School. When I graduated, there was nothing I could do for a living. You know, the film school was a big waste at that time. So I got a job working at a really downscale auction gallery on Broadway and 10th Street, cleaning up after the dog and and uh, carrying furniture. We would go out to homes on Long Island when people were either moving or had died. Same thing to me. Yeah, they, well, you're going to Florida. You know, it was just crazy. So we go out there, we tag everything, tag the furniture, bring it in, and show it on the weekends. I got my $20 a day for doing that, and every day I um, left the gallery. I bought Chinese takeout food. I bought a record album every single day. They were only $4.99 then or something. Um, and I went home and I listened to the record album 100 times and ate my Chinese food, and then went to a bar which is famous in now called Max's Kansas City. And it was a character bar. Lenny Bruce would have called it a character bar. And there was a back room where interesting and different people would kind of filter through. And I was sitting there one night when this guy with all curly blonde hair came in, and he said his name was Marjo, a combination of Mary and Joseph, and that somebody was making a documentary about him. That he was ordained by his Pentecostal parents who were on the 10th Circuit when he was 5 years old, married a couple when he was 6 years old. By the time he was 12, he had made $1 million. And when his voice changed, he couldn't be the miracle child anymore. And I said, that's a book. And he said, well, I need a writer. So I said, I'm a writer. Guess it was a lie. He couldn't say, well, I move furniture, you know. So I said, well, I'm a writer. So he said to me, if you can sell it, you can write it. And I said, deal, 50-50. And I shook his hand and he said 50-50. And then I went home. He gave me cartons of material about him. And that very night, I sat down and I wrote the following words because I used these words for almost every other book I wrote. Maybe the first 5 books. Well, it worked for Marjo. It was, there are thousands of them out there every night. They come from the flat plains of the Midwest and the big cities of the East. They come to see Marjo, the miracle child, anointed of God. And I wrote a 9-page proposal. I mean, it was purple prose. And then to cut things short, I found out there was an agent named Shirley Bernstein, and who was Leonard Bernstein's sister, and she really wasn't an author's agent. Um, oh, okay.
Oh, thank you so much.
And she really wasn't an author's agent. She represented lyricists and Broadway theater people. But actually went into her office. They didn't even want me there. They didn't accept manuscripts. But I went into her office and her office door was open and I did this little tap dance about Marjo, the miracle child. And she came out of her office and said she would read it. And then 2 weeks later, she called me and said it was sold to Harper and Row. It was called back then. And Marjo, the movie Marjo, won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 1973. And it pulled my so-so book, as the first thing I ever wrote. It pulled the book along with it. And suddenly I had this big hit book. I was 26 years old and everything changed. You know, I was a writer and what was I going to do next?
But
And
this is an unheard of story. I mean, that somebody could do that. I remember Marjo. I
right,
remember him being on television talk
right.
shows and the Pentecostal, you know, go for hours in tongues or whatever. And for you to meet him in a bar, convince him to do this deal, write and walk in to an agent, which I mean couldn't be done anymore today, but to do it then was pretty damn hard.
Yeah.
It's quite a remarkable story. Did you realize then
Wayne
how?
Myers, go back to Wayne Myers. He taught me, he told me, go ahead, take advantage, try the old try. I mean, he really taught me a lot of things other than, you know, trying to cure my homosexuality. He was really a father to me, like he was to Bruce Springsteen, by the way. He was really a father to me and really told me to go ahead and do these things. And when I told Wayne Myers that I had gone into the office and Shirley Bernstein and I did this story and she took it, and I had a book contract. He was so proud. He was so happy. He was absolutely thrilled that because I don't think anybody thought I was going to do anything other than move furniture. So, so the book starts later than that,
Yep.
and I forget. Does the book start with the first girl that I fell in love with?
Is that Dot? Or
That's I forget what name I gave her,
okay.
but
But
I did meet a girl at a bar, and this was the time when I was being a serial romance, and it was very unfair to the women because they want to fall in love with somebody, find a mate, a husband, have children, have a whole life ahead. And for me, it was a science project. And I thought that was cruel. And it made me feel very, very bad that I wasn't going to go through with this. And that I mean, sleeping with somebody isn't going through. But there was one girl that I met. She's now a lawyer. The last I looked, she was somewhere in Texas and she was defending, defense lawyer defending poor people. She always said she wanted to do that when we were together. And then as the relationship went on, one day she said to me, called me cowhead. She said to me, you know, I love you, but we know this is really the right thing. And I said, you're right. Uh, and that's it. I went full bore into the gay world in New York in the 70s. And you would just not believe how I don't want to call it trashy. You just wouldn't believe what it was like. With the sex bars, the sex clubs, the bathhouses, the backroom places. It was just, and everybody was doing it. My lawyer, who was with Paul Weiss, a very important thing, a very important law firm, he was doing it. The people I respected a great deal were running around and having sex all over the place. There wasn't AIDS at that time, so I was miserable. I was unhappy at the Greta Garbo home. I would wake up and I would look over to see who was sleeping next to me. It was really a dreadful, a very sad time. And Wayne Myers stopped seeing me. I went to see another psychiatrist who was supposedly going to teach me how to be happy being gay. That's in this Greta Garbo home book. And then I finally, I met a boy, I met a guy who I call Floyd the Outlaw in this book, and I felt was really my first giant crush on another guy. And he moved in with me, and I was crazy about him. And we went to a movie one night, and there was this woman coming up the aisle, and she had big breasts and she looked like a hooker. She wasn't, let me tell you, but she looked that way. And he said, "Wow, I really like her," because he was kind of bisexual, and he started to date her, and she took him away from me. Is the way I felt about it, and so it was very sad for me. I was brokenhearted. I'd never gone through something like that. I stopped eating, and I was what a 14-year-old girl does when she has her first boyfriend and breaks up. That was my thing. I couldn't eat. I couldn't do anything. It just absolutely drove me crazy. And then um, I tried to pull myself out of it. And a year went by, and opened up. The windows were open. It was spring on, and at the Greta Garbo home, and a woman came by, and she stuck her head in the window, and she said, "Do you hate me?" And I said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm Phyllis." With I said, "Oh my God." Look, she was sophisticated. She had hair, her outfit, everything. I said, "You look so different." She said, "Well, I had Hodgkin's disease and I had just gone into remission and I didn't feel sexy. So I got a wig and I got hot pants. And then my friend said to me, Phyllis, you look like a hooker. Get rid of it." So she slowly went back into this very sophisticated woman. She was a costume designer and a stylist for commercials. She was very, very successful and she was awfully sweet. And I said, "Yeah, please come in and let's." And so that was the beginning of a really wonderful, wonderful couple of years that I spent with Phyllis.
you were very caring to her.
And she got sick again.
Yeah.
She
But
got
while
sick
she was
again.
living with you, and
Well, Marjo happened when she was living with me. I mean, she encouraged me and was proud and everything. But she got she relapsed,
mhm.
and I really didn't know how to. I was still at this point only 25 or 26, and I didn't know how to take care of. First of all, she said that she was only 8 years older than me. Um, it turned out she was 12 or 13 years older than me. Not that really matters, but I'm just saying she was a much older person. She was in her 30s and she was very ill. Um, we came, I tried my best, but her sisters finally came and took her to Philadelphia, where she was originally from, and they took care of her to the end. And this is very, very much part of what that book is like. And then there was the next step. I don't even remember what the next step is. Do you
So
remember?
the next step, you had written it that Phyllis came first before meeting Marjo,
Well, what happens
or
is
in the middle of.
yes, Phyllis does come first. And what I did was I promised Phyllis I was never going to go to Max's Kansas City ever again. Um, it wasn't a gay bar, but it was really, I said, promise Phyllis I wouldn't do that. And one night, we, her friends paid for us to go to Florida so she could get some sun. She was very ill. And we came back to the Greta Garbo home and I put her to bed and I had to go look for a parking spot. Went immediately to sleep. She was exhausted. And I drove around and I thought, what the hell if I go to Max? That's when I met Marjo. You know, Phyllis, and then I came home and I woke Phyllis up. I met this guy, Marjo, and I'm going to write his book. Thought, how can that happen? And so that's how that happened. When Marjo came out, she was already very ill, and her sisters came and took her back to Philadelphia. So that's how that happened.
And there were a lot of celebrities living the same kind of life as you. You talk about Tennessee Williams meeting you one night.
It's such a funny thing. I was in Max's, Kansas City, and I was in Max's, Kansas City with my friend Bob Fiden. He used to go there all the time, and we were there very early. And he said to me, Tennessee Williams is at the table behind you. And I said, "Well, come on." He said, turn around and look. I said, I don't want to. So he takes a fork, and he throws it on the floor. So I have to go and get the fork. And I look, this is Tennessee Williams. So Fiden says, go and introduce yourself. And I said, why would he said, to me, Tennessee Williams. So I go over to the table and I said, hi, I'm a big fan. And we have some conversation. And then my friend Bob comes over and Lady St. Just, who was his best friend, said, what's the nature of your relationship? And I said, Leopold and Loeb. And she
Any
looked at
familiar to any
Tennessee.
of you? Familiar? They were the Chicago guys who were friends and decided, very well educated, very wealthy, decided they could commit the perfect murder. And they kidnapped a child, not anybody related to them, and they actually killed the child. It's a hugely famous
It's
criminal
Compulsion,
case.
isn't that the name of the book? Compulsion,
Compulsion was
the movie.
the book and movie in the 50s or 60s, and it's a very famous case. And I want to say Darrow represented them, maybe
Yes, somebody like that.
somebody
It was
really
Clarence
famous.
Darrow.
It's
Yeah.
yes, Clarence Darrow, um, very good sir, the baseball cap that the guy I'm married to. Anyway, so yeah, so
You would
you
have thought that Tennessee looked at Lady St. Justin. She looked at him, and he said, "Sit down."
because you said Leopold.
Because I said Leopold, no. She said, sit down. So, and that was the beginning of not a true friendship with Tennessee, but it turned out that the next day he was going to a screening at Andy Warhol's factory of a film. I forget it was Trash or what it was. And he invited me and my friend Bob to go with him. And that's how I met Warhol, who later became a big part of my life. Well, 1,000 people knew Andy Warhol as much as I knew him. But I mean, but he did become a big part of my life, Andy. And that was the moment. And everything started to change. I wrote Marjo, it was a hit. I knew Andy Warhol, and I got really into the fast lane of New York. You know, drugs, coke. I wasn't a big druggie,
Mhm.
but I never took a psychedelic ever because I was afraid that I would lose my mind. I already thought I was kind of unstable. I tried to kill myself. I'd been in a psychiatric hospital. I told somebody I could write a book. I thought if I take a psychedelic, so I never did. But whatever the drugs were at the time of Quaalude and stuff like that. And so Andy really liked me. He thought I was great fun, but he had a little clique that followed him around and pushed away outsiders. Um, but he was still great, and that became part of my life. Also, this is all in the book, The Greta Garbo Home. But
And,
can I just say something?
yes.
I never would have
Okay.
published one of these things first, or the Greta Garbo Home, if it wasn't for Delphinium Press. Small presses are so important in this industry. I can't begin to tell you. I was blessed by being introduced to them and them saying, yes, we will publish these books. So I'm very, very grateful to them.
Well, you're right to commend small presses. It's harder and harder to get anywhere near a big
And
publishing
six-figure
house.
deals, six-figure deals.
And to have stories like yours so well written that are told and brought into the world is a real credit to Delphinium Press and those like
Absolutely.
it. So thank you for
Absolutely.
acknowledging
You're
them.
welcome.
Now, I spent a lot of time prosecuting in the 70s.
Well, I remember.
And
You were tough. You were, and
ooh,
and you prosecuted sex crimes when it wasn't, it was an unusual thing. We didn't have people to go after people who were committing sex crimes.
it was a new topic, but where I'm going is one of the places that was on the radar screen of every prosecutor was Studio 54
Hmm.
because of the drug use and just really open, outrageous drug use.
Hmm.
You had a way in. You got into
I
50.
got the job as the top of the pop columnist for the Sunday News. I don't know how I
Yeah,
did
how
all
did you
these
do
things.
that?
Well, somebody called and said that the top of the pop columnist had passed away suddenly at a rock concert. She had asthma. She had a heart attack. And I said, who's going to take that job? And they said, who knows? So I called the Daily News. I called and I said, I hear that Lillian Roxon passed away and I'd like her job. And they said, come up to the office. And I'm telling you, the way you kind of really, so I went up there, and for 7 years, I was the top of the pop columnist. And so when Studio 54 opened up, I had free access. Not only that, I was gay, I was kind of cute then. Steve Rubell liked me. So I had free entrance, and here are drink tickets, and here's some cocaine for you. And it was just unbelievable. So, and I had great times there. And talk about an addiction. Studio 54 itself was an addiction. Once you started going there, I want to go back again. And I had free admission and drink ticket. So,
And
and
I'm going to interrupt
I'm
and say there,
sorry.
there were rope lines. I mean, for people who weren't there were rope lines outside and hugely long lines of people who wanted to get in. So to be able to, but it was often Steve Rubell himself who was at the door saying, no, 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 yes. And so to get in was a feat in itself. You didn't just walk in the door.
It was like yesterday when I spoke about the Beatles here. There was a fist fight at the door to get in. It wasn't me, it was the Beatles. But yes, it was an amazing thing that there were crowds and crowds of people, and he would say him and point me out in the back. And so I went there all the time. And then, Linda, this is also in the book. Um, can I just call you Linda?
Of course you
Yes.
can go.
No, I'm just thought, oh my God, I used the wrong name. So there was a bartender, and his name was Bobby Cohn. I changed his name to Robert John Cohn. And I said to him, and we went home one night. He was 21, and I was, I don't know what, years older. I'm not exactly sure at that point. But um, I just, I was so taken with him physically and the whole thing, and a Studio 4 bartender. And he was all muscly and everything. And I said, why don't you write a book about Studio 54? I'll write it with and he said, okay, he would. And so that was a powder keg. Oh, oh boy, did I, for a band from Studio 54, a million people angry with me. I wrote a really, really bad Romana Clay. Romana Clay is French for novel of keys. Everybody's disguised, but if you understand who one person is, you can figure out who all the others are. Well, of course, I didn't have that finesse. I named people like Halston was Ellison. Who would ever know that? Steve Rubell was Steve Shorter. So they were pretty angry at me, and a lot of this is just hysterical. And the bartender and I moved home while I was writing this book. Um, there was there was a Broadway show being done called Got to Go Disco, and they asked me to write it. I didn't know how to write a Broadway show. Gary Brandt asked me to write Got to Go Disco, and it was $12 million backing, which at that time was a huge amount of money. Um, and so uh, I read in the New York Times that I had been fired, and thank God, they didn't even tell me. But so I see Jerry Brandt, the producer, and he says, "You know where we got this money from? There's that $100 million marijuana sale, and they have it stuck in this bank on this island and everything." And he said, "You should write about this." And I said, "But it's your show." He said, "Show's going down. The show's going to burn. Write the story." So I wrote the story, and that was really scary. The phone rang. It's Steve Gaines. Yes, you're going to find your brains on the sidewalk tomorrow. I mean, these people had $100 million stuck in a bank somewhere. It made headlines, drug money in Broadway show and disco show. So that was the beginning of my reputation of, uh-oh, I mean, anything goes. So, um, so that was part of it. And then I don't remember the funny thing with Andy. There was this columnist who wanted to sleep with me desperately, Jack Martin. Um, I kept on saying, Jack, there are all these beautiful boys. Why me? And I said to Andy Warhol, why is Jack Martin running after me? And Andy said, I can't figure it out. I have no idea. But he wanted me to write a book with him called Husbands and Other Lovers. And then I was broke, and met him at the Russian Tea Room. He gave me a check for $5,000. And I said, Jack, no, 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 I can't do this. I know what this is about. He said, no, Anne Margaret invited you and me to Las Vegas to see her show. He was an old fashioned, nasty gossip columnist. He worked for the Inquirer. He was in Hollywood. He knew all these people. And I said, Jack, I'm not spending the weekend with you in Las Vegas. And here is the $5,000 back. And he said, no, no, no. And there was this whole argument. So I put it in my pocket and I cashed it. And then the next thing was Andy was, gone asleep with him. He gave you $5,000. He did not give it to me. First of all, I'm not that great at lay to get 5 grand. I don't know what he expected. The whole thing was so all of that is in the book, and when the club came out, when the book about Studio 54 came out, they announced it was with a big publisher too, William Morrow. Halston and his people and all the rest announced, I think, $20 million lawsuits against me. They were suing me. We were never actually presented with a lawsuit, but there were letters signifying that they were going to sue us, and William Morrow had to show that to their insurance company. It was their responsibility if somebody was going to sue them, and so they cut off my advances. We had sold the paperback to Banton for $125,000. They didn't pay it because I was going to be sued, and I thought I was back to base one. Thought I was back at the stuff, and I'm not sure how it ends. I think it ends in Rancho Mirage, and I'm sitting next to you, and that's how it ends, basically.
Well, except that in between, let's see, how many books have you written?
I think 16. I'm not sure, but I also ghost wrote some books for people, some that worked and some didn't work. I ghost wrote a book for Christy Brinkley, not the one that just came out, but one I did about 5 or 6 years ago, and I loved being with her, but I knew that that book wasn't going to work. And then I wrote a whole bunch of other books, none of which I can rember now. I wrote a
You
couple.
wrote
Oh,
a
I know,
great book.
Philistines at the
Oh my
Hedgerow.
God, one of my favorite books before I knew you, before I knew I'd be meeting you here, Philistines at the Hedgerow, which is about East Hampton, both its history up through current times. And you live there.
Yes, that book was just so lucky. Somebody said to me, write about the Hamptons. And so it went back to the Native Americans, to the Indians, and how it started, and who the Montaukets was, and how the culture began to grow, the very first rich people that went there, and then what it was like now. And also was one of those moments where the words flow, the words came out of me. And the book, it was on the Times bestseller list for 16 weeks, um, which is
Miraculous feat.
it was
Doesn't happen
really,
often.
yeah, it was really great. And I love Philistines. It's still my best book. Uh, No, maybe the other one is.
Well, this is so
Since
personal.
you guys are
and
here,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, buy
yeah,
this book. But Phyllis, the history
I
that
know.
you found, the Gardner family, what
Fabulous. Oh
had
my God, what a story going out to the Gardner Island and the crazy
this is
Gardner
an island off the end of Long Island between the
private
north,
island.
private
Yes.
island, a gift of the king, King George, maybe, one of those,
Or a pirate. There were pirates there. It was really quite amazing.
to this family, and there are only two living.
They were warring. There was one uncle who said he owned the island, and there were others. And then so he would show up and bring a tour group with him when he knew they weren't going to be there. And then he would go up, he'd bring the tour group up into the bedroom, and he'd lay down on the bed with his shoes on, and everybody took pictures of him. And then the family came home, and there was a riot, and it was you were in my bed with your shoes on, and it was just absolutely crazy. They still own the island. But there were other stories. There were modernist stories. It was about uh, Martha Stewart fighting with her neighbors. There were rich people behaving badly, like you wouldn't believe.
The
And
real estate guy, was it Alan
Alan
Schneider?
Schneider,
I mean,
what a character! What a liar! It's so
you
it's so
called him
funny.
out. You called him.
But no, but what happened was, is he passed away, and his mother and father showed up, and it turned out he wasn't Presbyterian; he was Jewish. And he turned out he hadn't gone to a private school. It turned out everything was made up, and they believed him. So when they found out, he became a real character. And though he was already dead, but people talked about him for years and years.
And writing that book about the Hamptons and exposing a lot of very interesting, both historical facts, but exposing current events, sort of. Did it cause any problem for
They
you
no, they
living there?
loved the book. No, everybody there, nobody was angry. It's just really amazing. They loved the book. The book wasn't nasty. It
No.
wasn't like the Romana clay. The book was. I'm still living there, so uh, it goes to show. So no, they love Philistines, and so do I. Sometimes I pick it up. Sometimes I pick up my books and say, "Who wrote that? What? How did that come out of me? If I could only show Dr. Myers,
Right,
what
right.
what this all led to."
Yeah,
So
yeah, which would be wonderful. Are you working on something now? Maybe the next phase of
yes,
post Greta Garbo, or
yes, I am actually. There's a really, really great book in Max's Kansas City.
I bet. Oh
There's
my God.
because
It
there
was, I mean, for those of you who don't know, if you're entirely West Coast, it was the go-to place
for
for a
artists,
very long time.
artists and
Artists,
writers, not
musicians, I mean,
yeah. It was a very, very important place in cultural history and all the rest. For the front part of the bar was all the famous artists, people who had become very, very famous. Like when the Cedar Tavern closed, Max's took over, and in the back there were writers, there were X-Men, there were. It was crazy, and a lot of things came out of that place. And so I kind of want to write about that. And then I'm working on something else that I really love. Everybody's going to go, oh no. You know who the actress Sylvia Miles is?
yes, of course. Oh my
Yeah.
God, she was a classic.
No, she really was. So, and she became a friend of mine, and I always wanted to write about her. We have 6 seconds left, and I just came back from Berlin, where I obtained the rights to her story and all her papers and
Ah,
appointment calendars and diaries and everything. So, that's what I'm
that's a
up to.
good, that's a very good next book to look forward to. We hope you will write it soon and come back to Rancho Mirage
This
and
is a
talk to.
fabulous. This event is just amazing.
Yeah,
I'm
I don't know
so
how
honored.
many of you have been here from the beginning and watch it grow from a very small crowd with, I think, 12 writers to what it is today. And we thank you for making it even better, Stephen.
Oh,
And
thank you. I think
eh,
you're thanking them. Thank you.
and
Thank you.
we welcome you
Thank
back.
you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jacob Soberoff with Todd Purdom.
Hello. Before I sit down, I've been saying, well, first of all, give it up for Todd. Oh, we give it up for Jake. I've been saying at all these stops on the book tour, I'm going to take a selfie to send it to my mom and dad, but my mom and dad are here today. So I'm just going to take a selfie to send to somebody else. I don't know. Hold on one second. Smile, everybody. Thank you. Okay.
Our media age. Jacob is coming in hot. He arrived last night fresh from Colbert, and it's a privilege to have him here at
Thank
the
you.
festival, and it's a privilege to talk to him.
I wanted just a disclaimer that because I've been in both New York, where it's been absolutely freezing, and Minnesota, where it's been absolutely freezing, I was going to wear a t-shirt no matter what for this. So,
Well, your dad is a man after my own heart. He's in shorts. So like we live in LA, and I virtually never wear long pants, so I've made a concession to that.
we like short apparel in this family.
But it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about your powerful book. And when I was reading it and understanding the challenge you face, I thought of something James Michener once said about Gone with the Wind. He said one way to think of it was that Margaret Mitchell had sat down and written a powerful long story about a calamity that befell her hometown. And you had the burden of covering a calamity in real time without the opportunity for 10 years of writing a reflection. And could you just take us back to that moment in January a year ago when you were faced with this challenge?
Yeah, in fact, I'll take you 10 days before that when I was sitting around a campfire, which I write about in the book, in El Capitan Canyon, just north of Santa Barbara, where we go.
Campground.
It's so fun. We go every New Year's with our friends. And I was sitting after having a conversation with the president of editorial of NBC News, who had basically said to me, this year, after 10 years, you're going to become what's known as a coverage correspondent, which in our line of work is you get kind of called out to anything that might be happening at any given time.
You put on your roller skates and get out to the fire.
It might be a cat in a tree, it might be a murder trial, it might be a celebrity, something or other. And I didn't want to do it, but she said, look, you're in California and we're going to try it for 3 months and you're going to do it. So I'm sitting at the campfire with my friend Sam Falls, and he said, are you looking forward to this year at work? And I said, not really. The last thing I want to do in Southern California as a coverage correspondent is put on that stupid fucking, yellow jacket and go cosplay and cover wildfires. I was mad. And literally 10 days later, not only did my hometown burn down, but my childhood home, the house I was born into, carbonized before my very eyes. And as I sat there at my desk in the NBC News Bureau in LA, I got a text from my brother Miles, who said, big Palisades fire, we're evacuating. He lived up where the Palisades fire had rekindled from the earlier Lockman fire. And I walked into the office of the bureau chief, who knew I sort of had a dirty diaper about the idea of covering fires. And I said, I got to go. I said, I grew up in that neighborhood that's on my television screen on the local news right now. And it started 2 weeks of nonstop around the clock coverage of watching LA burn, the costliest wildfire event in American history. 16,000 structures, 30. Did anybody here know anybody or lose a house or, yeah, wow.
Well, so you're.
Oh my gosh. 16,000 structures, 31 people died. 3 times the size of Manhattan burned. They say maybe 400 people with excess mortality. And I didn't know in real time how to process what I was doing. I was standing at the corner that in my head was like where people lined up for the 4th of July parade and the road race. And I was watching, a block and a half away from where my childhood home was burning to the ground. And I just opened my mouth and talked and said what I could, but there was no processing. And that's what this book is. And I thought it was ultimately a look into my past. I thought it was like a time machine to go back and see everything that I knew foundationally. The public park that my parents raised money for in 1986 burned down. The schools in town, the houses of worship, the grocery stores, everything. But really what it was, I now know, in spending time with so many people who also went through this, both in the Palisades and Altadena, it was the fire of the future. It's the future all of our children will inhabit. And the book might read like a sci-fi thriller, but really it's the lived reality of not just Angelenos, but people around the country and around the world. And there's a version of this that's coming to all of us at some point. So I wanted to understand really what it was, and that's what the book is.
Could we walk back just a little bit, because you said you didn't really like the idea of being responsible for spontaneous breaking coverage. You had deep dives,
Exactly.
deep looks at things like the family separation policy in the first Trump term. You wrote a very highly regarded book about that. What made you want to become a journalist in the first place?
Steve Soberov. I grew up, I cried at the LA event. I'm going to cry at this one too, probably. I grew up watching my dad in civic life go around Los Angeles.
Head of the police commission, head of
Before that, the head of the Parks Commission. Before that, on the Harbor Commission.
And that didn't sour you on journalism?
No, I loved it. I didn't know anything about journalism. I just knew my mom too. We were involved in civic life deeply in LA. I got to go meet people who were so different from us all the time. He worked with the school system, the parks, all of it. And to get the opportunity to be a part of civic life in LA, and then when I went to New York to work for Mike Bloomberg as an advance man, because of following my dad's mayoral campaign, I loved politics. And I got to NYU. NYU was my 7th day. 9/11 was my 7th day.
As an undergraduate freshman.
As an undergrad, yeah. And actually, this was so triggering in terms of PTSD about remembering that day, seeing people, you guys remember, in the streets with their suitcases and their wheelchairs and the trees on fire behind them, just really running for their lives. I put to use in journalism the skills I got hanging out with my mom and dad in LA, learning from Mike Bloomberg, who said to me, sorry for all the swearing, but the first thing he ever said to me as an advanced guy, which is like the most important job in politics you've probably never heard of, which is soak up all the info, turn around, tell it to the boss. If you mess up, it's on him or her. These are some of the most consequential people in American politics who have these jobs. And he said, don't fuck it up. And I said,
Don't like Mike Dukakis appear in a tank with a helmet.
With the helmet on, exactly. That didn't go so well for him. And that's what I do. That's what I do in this job. I never went to journalism school. I turn around and I tell the camera, like I would be telling Mike Bloomberg, like, here's what you guys need to know. And so when I got to the Palisades, it was like a double whammy because I was doing that, but I also, in a way, it was only firefighters and us. There was none of you guys were there. And I had to speak for my community at the same time. And that was a different muscle that I had never really exercised before.
Could you talk a little bit about the strange feeling, which I know more than I'd like to about, of exhilaration, fear, excitement, fright that you must have felt on that morning when you said, I've got to go, and you rented a Jeep wagon. The Jeep Wagoneer had been rented by your producer. You grab a handful of Cliff Bars and Coke Zeros.
Exactly.
Which I guess the NBC bureau had stocked in the pile.
Yeah.
What
you have to pay for them, actually. I had to pay for them before I left the door, but I put on my corporate card.
What are you feeling at the mix of gut clenching emotions in that moment?
Like sick to my stomach, actually.
Yeah. Did you ever actually get sick?
No, but I got in the car and we talked about well, the funny thing is Polly, the bureau chief, who's just such a dear friend, said, it's, you know, the Californians from SNL, like, did you ever see that skit? She's like, don't take the 101 to the 405 to Sunset because the traffic's gonna be so bad. And I was like, no way, it's exactly what I did. But the whole time I was just thinking of anything other than, I was like, what roads am I gonna take? I was talking to Bianca Seward, the producer who was with me, about, we had just covered the election in 2024, gossiping about work. I did not want to focus on what I was about to go see. And when I pulled up to the intersection of Amalfi and Will Rogers, I had said to the guys on the radio, you could read about it in the book, JB Rudigarama, a cameraman who I'd been to Haiti with. I mean, I've been in some really hairy situations with these guys, and Alan Rice. And I said, like, let's go to Swarthmore and Sunset. We're going to go to the middle of the village, and we're going to stop right there. And when I got to the Riviera and the Palisades, I just knew, I was like, we're not going any further than this. I think I went down into the Dead Man's Curve.
You knew enough to know about where you weren't able to go beyond.
I had closed my eyes. It was trash day, Tuesday, like trash cans were everywhere. I could close my eyes, and so weird the things that make me emotional when I tell you about this, and drive through that community, you know. And I just knew, I was like, we have to stop here. And from that ridge, I could see Will Rogers State Park burning, and I knew over the hill, you know, the whole Palisades is on fire.
I would say the biggest argument my wife and I have in our life is really between the navigation app and the Thomas Guide that's still in my head. And actually, when we moved back to LA in 2014, I bought a vintage Thomas Guide on paper so I could have it with me in the car because, you know, page 632 is really much better.
You know.
But I can't quite imagine. I come from a small town in Illinois, which has never really had any disaster befall it. But when I was reading your book, what kept coming through my mind, and I didn't have to cover January 6th in the Capitol, but I spent so much time in that building over the years of my reporting career. that I found myself overcome with emotions, and I frankly remain overcome at the thought of that day and in anger at the revisionist history that has changed our interpretation of it.
Amen.
But to watch your workplace, your neighborhood, the place of so many associations literally disappear in front of your eyes, and then have to have the equipoise to talk about it on live television while you're taking your mask off to avoid choking.
Yeah.
You know, you've been in some tight spots, Haiti, other places, but had you ever really done anything that approached that?
No, but I will say that when I'm stressed or under pressure or feeling anxious, that's like my flow state. My brother Miles told me a story one time about um, how he had the good fortune to go with my dad, I think the day after the 2001 mayoral election, and sit courtside at the Laker game. And Kobe Bryant was right next to my brother, who was probably like just a teenager at that point. And Kobe looked at my brother and said, "Nice to meet you. What's your name, Miles? Nice to meet you." And he went out, and I think he like won the game on a game-winning shot, and the whole place is going absolutely bonkers. And Kobe came and sat back down as everybody's just chanting his name and talking to him, and he looks over and he looks at my brother and he goes, "How'd you like that shot, Miles?" And that's how I feel when I'm like out reporting like that. And so that's why I didn't have time to process it, because when I'm there and I'm at work, I'm in the zone. And it's probably why I cry now, but not then, you know. None of this was going through my body. It was just, I know all this stuff. I know this is super consequential. I called my bosses back in New York and I said, I think it was the day of Jimmy Carter's funeral, if I'm not mistaken.
It was.
And January 6th anniversary had just happened the day before. So that's what they were talking about on cable news. And I just picked up the phone, I called my bosses and I said, "This is enormous. Like, you don't understand how enormous this is." So it was Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC, now MS Now, same mission, new name. Don't
But
forget
you were
it.
at MS then.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. And I just said, "We got to get on TV." And so they put me on, and that's how it all got going.
And was there any lack of understanding? We often feel living here in California that our friends on the East Coast either don't understand the impact of something's happened here, or think that because you live in Los Angeles, your house must be on fire.
It's
Not
so true.
understanding that, if you live in Hancock Park as we do, yes. But the other thing that I did feel in the aftermath, people would call and ask, "Are you okay?" And the honest answer for anyone who lived in the greater Los Angeles basin in the aftermath of those fires was, nobody here is okay,
No,
because it was
yeah.
one of those rare things that is a collective experience for all of Southern California.
That's the word.
Like the Dodgers,
Yeah, exactly. That's the word that I was going to use too. It's we all experience the collective trauma together, all across Southern California. By the way, Altadena, dozens of miles away, also two communities were virtually wiped off the map. Exactly. Um, and I think that it's going to take a very long time for us to come back from this. And my television news broadcasting was my first draft. The book is my second draft. And I think that there will be many other stories from many other people. I hope, just like when I covered family separation, I hope that all the children are able to tell their stories at some point as well. I just knew I needed to get it down for myself. And I'm I'm flabbergasted how many people the book has meant something to them in the same way.
In that context, could I ask you a little bit about tradecraft? Because you were seeing these things through the prism of where you were in your fixed place, or
Yes.
moving around to the degree that you could. You couldn't have possibly known the whole story. So as you came to write the book, what was your research process like? Obviously, you had the tapes of you could go back and see your live on-air appearances. I know you relied on other newspaper accounts, other media accounts, and then people that you couldn't have met or known in Altadena particularly. How did you navigate all that?
Yeah, I love this question. My favorite part about my job, whether I'm on an election line, walking up and down it, during election night coverage, or on the floor of the Republican or Democratic convention, or on the plaza at the Today Show, meeting people who come to New York, is talking to people. That's like what I get from my folks. I love being around other people. But because, as I said, there was nobody there, I knew that if I was going to tell this story, I needed to spend time with people. And so I started to try to understand what this fire of the future was. And I started with Jonathan White, a career civil servant in the career public health service corps under the Surgeon General, who had been to every mass casualty fire in the last 5 years. I knew him because he helped children during family separation. And he's the one who said, what you experienced is not a look into your past, it was the fire of the future. And he kind of broke it down in these 4 ways: climate change, infrastructure, changes in the way we live, meaning like electric car batteries were exploding and firefighters getting cancer, and misinformation and disinformation. And so using that rubric, I started to seek out all these people. And so I spent time with wildlife biologists, meteorologists at the National Weather Service, firefighters in Altadena and the Palisades and in the Forest Service and from Manhattan Beach, residents from the Palisades, workers from the Palisades in Altadena. I went back to the street where I interviewed Gavin Newsom on Meet the Press, and I met as many of the residents on that street as I could because nobody was there when we were there. Every house was gone but one. So I got to know Kate Hennigan, an engineer from JPL. Hundreds of her colleagues at Caltech lost their homes in the Eaton fire. Herb and Lloyda Wilson from UPS. They're
We were on
36 years.
vacation in Hawaii when
They
this
were
happened, right?
unreal. They were there in Lahaina, where people had run for their lives and jumped into the ocean to save their life in the
On
last
Maui.
massive community conflagration. I got to spend time with all these people. I went to the governor's office and spent several hours alone in his office with him talking about this. And that's what I did. I with my same iPhone that I have here, recorded our conversations, transcribed them, and tried to reconstruct their stories alongside mine. And that's what the book is. It's as much about people as it is about politics or climate change, or a minute by minute account of what it was like for me to be in the fire. It's their story too.
Did you take any time off from your day job to do this, or did you squeeze it in?
No, it was brutal. I would go to the office, the same bureau that I left from that morning, on the weekends. And my wife, Nicole, and I worked out a deal where one day a weekend, I would spend most of the day in the office. And in between my other assignments, and NBC was, I'm not at NBC anymore, but they were amazing enough to allow me to go to meet NASA scientists who were studying the fire of the future in Georgia and Florida as for today's show, but it became a part of the book.
So you could scratch both itches at once.
Totally. The Forest Service, I went to the Pacific Northwest and met a firefighting captain who taught me about wildland firefighting and being a hotshot, even in the middle of winter when it was snowing in Oregon and Washington, where I was with him. I piggybacked the two gigs, and then in the middle of all this, the ice raids started to happen, and that too overlaps with this, and we can talk about it. But
last summer in LA.
Yeah, starting in June. And when it comes to the rebuilding, part of the reason it's going so slow is the convergence of these two stories that I've covered. That they're not going. It's not going to surprise anybody, but they're not going after the worst of the worst. They're going after people who are standing in Home Depot parking lots looking to be a part of rebuilding the Palisades in Altadena, and they're beating them up like they did Narciso Barranco, the landscaper in Santa Ana, California, who has 3 sons in the Marine Corps. And it's part of the reason there's 12 homes that have been rebuilt out of 16,000 structures that have been destroyed. There's lots of this book absolves no politician, not Karen Bass, nor Gavin Newsom. Bass was in Ghana. Newsom told me there's going to be a Marshall Plan 2.0. That hasn't materialized in name yet. Doesn't absolve Trump, who fanned the flames of misinformation and disinformation by pouring rhetorical gas on the real flames during all of this. There is no one proximate cause. There is no one person to blame. And that was one of the things I needed to understand when I set out to do this. And I know more than ever that these are confluences, pardon the term, conflagrations that allow these things to happen. And yes, why was the reservoir empty in the Palisades? Important question. Why were there not firefighters pre-deployed? Important question. Why were there steel lattice towers that have been dormant for years and not in use in Altadena where the wires electrified? Yeah. All these questions will be investigated, are being investigated, should be investigated. But I set out to write a story about what it's like to be in the middle of the fire of the future so other people can understand not just how long it will take to figure out the cause, if there is one, which I don't believe there's one proximate one, but to know that if we don't reckon with this, we're all going to be faced with the same thing that I went through.
I want to get to that challenge of the future, but since we're in the middle of the moment, I want to ask you about a telephone call you got in the middle of this whole crisis, since you mentioned the T word.
Yeah.
Could you I can't tell it nearly as well as you would tell it.
Sure.
So could you just tell me who called you, what she wanted, what you did, what happened after?
Well, lots of people called me as I stood in the Palisades to ask me to go check on their houses. And my brother was one, and I did. And Jake Levine, the kid I drove in high school carpool, I went to his house on El Medio, his mother's house, which had burned down.
Who was working in the Biden administration?
Working in the Biden administration at the time on the National Security Council. And on that same morning, on January 8th, my phone rang as I was getting ready to give a special report for Lester Holt. And I looked down and it said Katie Waldman. I said, that's odd. Katie Waldman was the junior most press deputy at the Department of Homeland Security when I covered family separation. She let me into the facilities. It's how I was able to write my first book, Separated. Katie Waldman became Katie Miller because she married a gentleman named Stephen Miller,
Who grew up in the?
who grew up in Santa Monica and in the Palisades. By the way, they're here right now. Let's welcome them. Come on in, guys. Just kidding. Just kidding. They're not here.
We wouldn't be here if they
Yeah.
were here.
Just kidding. They couldn't make it. Anyway, Katie called and I said, I got to call you back. I'm about to go up on a special report with Lester. And before I could call her back, I saw in my text she had said, address, it's Stephen's parents' house. Can you go check on it? So yeah, they had moved, I guess, from Santa Monica to the Palisades. I had no idea. And I said to myself, oh boy, am I about to go to Stephen Miller's parents' house? And I did. And I went, and it had burned down too. And I felt awful, really sad, terrible for them. And I took a picture just like I did for my brother and for Jake, other people who had called. And I said, the Palisades are stronger than politics. And I sent her a heart emoji. And within minutes of that, I looked at my phone and Donald Trump was tweeting, Xing, whatever he's doing, Truth Socialing, the craziest shit about the fire. That there's a mystical tap from the Pacific Northwest that we can open to put out the flames of the fire, that Gavin Newsom, Karen Bass
Has not turned on the faucet.
yeah, hasn't turned on the faucet. Elon Musk, her boss, because she was going to be the chief spokesperson for Doge, then goes and does this live stream with the firefighters saying that the pressure situation was a conspiracy, and the firefighters said what they will tell you today and civil engineers will tell you, which is why it also happened in Altadena, not just the Palisades. It's not the reservoir. You can't just flow that amount of water at any
Uphill.
one time. Yeah, exactly. It's just not possible. Would there have been a little more pressure with the reservoir? Maybe. And so again, I thought hard about including that story because I felt very guilty about there's a private moment for everybody, but she's a very public figure. And her, as I said, her bosses were pouring rhetorical fuel on the flames of the fire that were hurting everybody in a moment where it was so hard to get information. People weren't getting evacuation notices. People didn't hear accurate information from local officials. We were relying on apps or family text threads. And so it was hurting her in-laws too. And in the end, I felt like it was my duty as a journalist to report that story because it's part of this new age of disaster. Misinformation and disinformation are a part of hurting the prevention, mitigation, recovery from these things. And it didn't just affect people I knew directly, it affected the people from the incoming administration that were making it harder too.
But it also strikes me that it's part of our new age of incivility because there was a tender human moment. She asked you for
Yeah.
something. You did her a solid, and the repayment from her bosses was a flood of disinformation and vituperation that was, as you say, hurting her husband's own family and neighborhood.
A literal flood, ultimately, because Donald Trump released, it's unbelievable. I laugh, it's not even funny. 2.5 billion gallons of water into the Central Valley and flooded farms of people that are probably his supporters because he said he wanted to open the tap. That water didn't get to LA. It had nothing to do with the fires, but it was part of his message that he was taking control, just like this executive order that he's issued this week while withholding $36 billion of federal funds that the administration here has asked for as part of the rebuilding process. And again, he's not responsible for the fires. I'm not saying that. The spark that happened when the below the surface embers, the firebrand from the Lockman fire surfaced because of the Santa Ana winds that were forecast by the Weather Service was responsible in the Palisades. And the electrification of the tower in Altadena was responsible in the Eden fire.
And then the wind compounded everything. Right?
Yeah, and it was
inability to aerial firefighting was
the helicopters. They couldn't. You read about Dan Childs in my book, the chief pilot for the LA City Air Operations Division's unbelievable. Those guys.
And the call fell to him to.
He just said we got to ground ourselves. We can't do it. It's the last thing that those guys want to do. But they were saying that they were 50 or 100 feet off the ground and they were being pushed down at like 200 feet a second by the winds, and so they were going to crash and die. And so they said we're going to go
and help nobody.
Yeah, exactly. So there were so many factors. The political part of it, I mean, I'm a political reporter. It's an important part of the book. It's an important part of the story. It's not the only part of the story, but I would be derelict if I didn't include how, not just in the moment, but in the wake of the fire, this administration wasn't making the recovery more difficult.
Would you mind just reading this brief passage beginning at the top of page 146 that begins, "When I got to our old house"?
Yeah. You made me cry again. Damn it.
That's the point.
Yeah. When I got to our old house, I opened the door of the Wagoneer and I swung my legs out. Fire engine sat outside, but there was nothing to save. I don't really know what to say were the words that came out as our crew filmed me in real time. I was on the phone with my mom, FaceTiming. My hands were thrust in the pockets of my green fire pants. My NBC News baseball hat was on, and my face was caked in the soot that we had been standing in all morning. The house was made of red brick, later painted white by the owner, the Jacoby family, who bought it from my parents when I was around 5 or 6. They lived in it for 35 years. But when the house collapsed, the red brick was exposed again, as if, man, if the house were opening up to reveal something I hadn't seen since we moved away, welcoming me back home. I remember standing on the same street corner, manning a lemonade stand with my brother, hanging out in our backyard pool with my sisters, and looking out my bedroom window at the street. There was nothing left. Pulled out my phone and I called my mom on FaceTime. Mom, look at this. That Frontera, your birth house? She asked. As I panned the camera across the landscape, which looked as if it could have taken a direct hit from a ballistic missile, not all that different from what I had seen on the outskirts of Lviv, Ukraine, covering the early weeks of the war there. Yep. My mom let out a noise that was somewhere between a whimper and a sob. I'm so sad, she said. Every one of you was born in that house. The wind was picking up and it was hard to hear her, but the devastated look on her face communicated volumes. I know it makes me sad too, I told her, choking back tears of my own. We talked for a while and then I hung up. Tears traced a line through the blackness.
Given the number of hands that were raised, I don't need to tell people what the Palisades was like, but you write so movingly about being on the air with your colleague and friend, teenage friend, Katie Tur of then SNBC. And could you just explain for the live stream viewers and people who may be watching this later, what made the Palisades so special as a Los Angeles?
Same thing that made Altadena so special, where actually I spent maybe more time in my adult life with children than I did in the Palisades.
Because you live closer to.
Yeah, much closer. It's a community. It's a real community. So people lost their homes and new people. Anybody from the Palisades here? Wow, cool. How about Altadena? Anybody? Amazing. For coming. You know Altadena better than I do, but my son's 9th birthday was at Side Pie, a pizza place that burned down a month before the fire. Our kids, friends, went to the Waldorf school there. I was supposed to have dinner at a restaurant called Bernie, now called Betsy, on Thursday after the fire started on a Tuesday. These are small towns in big cities. LA is the county of neighborhoods, most populous county in the country. And the Palisades is the same way. When I think of the color red, I think of going in the fire station number 69 as a kid on like fire service day. They landed a helicopter. Am I right or did I imagine that? Did they land a helicopter across the street? Okay, yeah, across the street. I was like, man, I may have put some fake news in the book, but it was true. They would land a helicopter across the street and we would go in, and that's how I remember the Palisades. 4th of July parade, road race, going to the Chinese restaurant in the Palisades, Cafe Vita, Mort's Deli. That's why I included the story of Albino Fuentes in the book, who I've known for 35 years, because when I was a little kid at the steel counter at Mort's, where you would get your red tray and slide it all the way across to the end. And if you haven't been there, it's the Deli and Curb Enthusiasm from the Palisades. That's where Albie would be behind the thing. And when Mort's closed, he went over to Cafe Vita. And the first person I wanted to interview from the Palisades, because nobody was back, knew it was him. And so I texted the same family group chat. And my sister Molly this makes me cry too, it's weird. My sister Molly, I said, anybody have Albie's phone number? And my sister Molly right away was like, yeah, I have his phone number. And so I brought him back to the Palisades and we talked outside Cafe Vita. It's the most special place. One day I was there talking to Nicole Wallace live, and I was just saying, like, I remember that was my pediatrician's office. That's where my parents took the dogs to the vet. I could see it all.
You could go lot by lot.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the Methodist church behind me is burning down. Village school. It's a teeny tiny town, and it feels different. It felt different to me after my parents left, and only my brother lived there at the time of the fire, and he lost the house he was living in. But it's this, like, again, I can remember it. I had been to the park with my sister and Izzy, her newest son, who was like days old, 3 days before the fire. And we sat there, and every time we would go, I'd say, "There's the plaque," and I'd send a picture to them that day. The plaque that has my dad and my mom's name at the top, and all the people who they raised money with to build the park after he hit his head and cut it open when I was 3 years old on a piece of shit metal spaceship thing that they had there. It was like the Palisades is as much a part of my DNA as my family, and that is what it meant to me.
Could I just ask you about the larger issues that you focus on toward the end of the book? And I mean, the reality for all of us who live here in Paradise that we take for granted is that there's human habitation in Southern California on a scale that nature never intended.
Of course.
We're living in places that are beautiful and once were wild, and we're not supposed to be up in these canyons with houses and swimming pools and electric car batteries. So you mentioned this is the fire of the future. Governor Newsom said there's going to be no such thing as fire season anymore. Fire
Correct.
season is all the time.
Perpetually, yeah.
And in fact, this was after a period. This was not when this worst fire of ever broke out in a time when theoretically the fire season should have been
Middle of winter.
done. So what are the challenges for the future? Hardening targets is very hard. We love our climbing vines, our bamboo, our things that shroud our houses. People in the Palisades who've lived there a long time were house rich and cash poor. They don't have the money to tear down. They don't want to tear down their fences. They don't have the money to put fireproof roofs and all these kinds of
things
things.
went up like matchsticks, palm trees. It was crazy to watch the palm trees.
Yeah. So how challenging, even let's suppose we had a national administration that was supportive about these kinds of things, which we don't. But how hard is this going to be to really?
I think impossible, actually, to be honest with you. And I think that that's what this book taught me, is that this just has to be a reckoning that in the 60s, anybody lived through the Bel Air fire? When Bel Air burned down, the LA Fire Department in the 60s produced a documentary narrated by a famous Hollywood actor at the time called Design for Disaster. And the whole point of the documentary in the 60s was the way we live in the wildland-urban interface is designed to have these types of events exactly play out the way that they do. And in
a cyclical way too.
Yeah. And in the full generation since that, the previous worst fire in LA City history, we've only built further into the interface. The Palisades is in the foothills and in the Santa Monica Mountains. Altadena is in the foothills and in the San Gabriel Mountain. And we love the way we live. And yeah, you could try to harden your home or clear the brush or have regulations or have the state. And these are legitimate conversations about what should be cleared and what shouldn't be cleared from the state parks and what was prevented and all that stuff. But it's just a foregone conclusion that something like this will happen again. And if it didn't happen in the Palisades for one reason or another, it was still going to happen in Altadena. It's been happening just in the last year. In the Carolinas, we've seen fires. In New Jersey, we've seen fires. In Lahaina, again, I said people ran for their lives and jumped in the ocean to save their lives from fires. In Argentina, some of these same issues are coming up. In Argentina and in Chile, massive wildfires. In Argentina, conspiracy theories just like are happening in LA. That the Jews in Israel are responsible for the wildfires.
They're space lasers.
Space lasers, exactly. Yes. Matt Gaetz is involved in that. You'll not be surprised. This is the world that we live in. And so unless and until we can stop and say, this is what the new age of disaster is, we don't know how to prepare ourselves for it. And the eventual reality that this is probably coming in some form or fashion for everybody. It might be an ice storm or an extreme heat event. It might be a hurricane or a tornado, all these things that I've covered. But they're happening, and the way that we recover from them is more difficult than ever, I think.
You mentioned how comparatively little rebuilding has already happened. Altadena was an extraordinary enclave in LA that was multiracial and multi-income. The Palisades still had vestiges of the little Methodist community it originally was. Do you have a fear about how these communities will ultimately be rebuilt? Will they be rebuilt in a way that guarantees further fires? Will the Palisades just be full of richer and richer people that will build bigger and bigger homes in more and more vulnerable places? Or
I hate to say it, but probably. Again, the fissures come to the fore when these mass casualty events happen. And so I talked about the immigration one. How about affordability? We live in LA in the most unaffordable city and the most unaffordable state in the country. It's not just that insurance premiums are going up and the payouts are too low to rebuild and that the incomes are not enough to survive and rebuild your house. Life is just hard, period, from the Palisades to Altadena for anybody to make a decent living these days. And one of the studies that I saw, I think for home sales through the end of the year, were in Altadena, 44% of the homes, in the Palisades, 41%. 40 or 41% of the homes. The lots that are being sold to corporate investors, not to Californians or not to neighbors. And that's part of the problem. It has surfaced that the way of life we live here is not just heavily reliant on undocumented labor, but that it's within this unaffordability crisis that we all share, and it's going to make the recovery, unfortunately, much more difficult. Yeah.
You've just come not only from the Ed Sullivan Theater, but from Minneapolis, where
Yeah.
you've been covering another ongoing conflagration. Do you like breaking coverage now? Are you resigned to like? Are
No,
you
I'm
ready
very
to?
happy that I was there. I think that what we're seeing, we're in the most incredible, consequential moment, I think, that I've ever been a part of in my 11 years working at MS. Arrested Don Lemon today. It's abhorrent. Abhorrent. Don's a friend of mine. I was on a show the other day. The idea that going into a church and covering a protest in real time is
Makes you
ground
study
for the Justice Department to arrest you um, uh, for whatever the hell they're saying he's doing. It's out of control. And what's happening on the streets, not just in Minneapolis, but I've covered it myself from Los Angeles to Chicago to Charlotte to the hallways of 26 Federal Plaza in New York City, and now to my mom's hometown of Minneapolis. It is depraved. These are not the worst of the worst. These are people looking for a better life. They are Nore Santai Ramos, the high school AP student and track star, who was picked up and deported to Guatemala with her mother. They didn't send the medicine with her mother, so her mother died 2 weeks after I went to visit her in Guatemala, stuck there. It's Annie Lucia Lopez Beloza, the 19-year-old from Babson College, who was going home to visit her mom and dad in San Antonio for freaking Thanksgiving, and the ICE agents picked her up at the airport and sent her to Honduras, where she hadn't been since she was a single-digit kid. It's, as I mentioned, Narciso Barranco. It's Renee Nicole Good and Alex Petty. You know, they based this thing on the 1954 program that Dwight D. Eisenhower instituted that deported 1 million Mexicans and some Americans.
Which was called Operation.
I don't even say it's so racist, but it's, go look it up.
It's a moist word.
It's awful. And this is Stephen Miller's and Tom Homan, who's now in there as some kind of savior, is bizarre, for Greg Bovino, who was out there in his costume playing military man, throwing tear gas canisters. I was on the scene minutes after he did that the other day. They deported 1 million Mexicans and some Americans. Now they're killing immigrants and American citizens. Tom Homan said to me on the second day of the raids in LA, people are going to die as a part of this. They knew, he telegraphed it. And now it's happening. And whatever you think about immigration policy or what the Biden administration did, and I went to Haiti, I saw them deport a record number of Haitians to probably surefire death there. I wasn't a fan of the immigration policy of the Biden administration either. And this has been decades of bipartisan, deterrence-based, punitive-based immigration policy that obviously doesn't work. If it did, some solution from one of these administrations would have done something. It's time for a new and different approach. I'm not a policymaker, I don't know what it is, but I can tell you what's happening on the streets of America right now is not only depraved, but people are dying. And it's why I've been so heartened. It's the common thread between the two books. Heartened by seeing the people on the streets in Minneapolis. I just drove by here in Palm Desert, the high school kids holding signs on my way here about what's happening. It's the most unbelievable thing. It's what kicked Greg Bovino out of Minneapolis and out of LA and Chicago and Charlotte. It's the only thing that forced Trump into a reversal on family separation in the first term. He said, I didn't like the sight and the feeling of the families being separated. And they're starting to hear that our voices make a difference. And it's the same thing about the fire. The workers at NIOSH, who I met, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, you meet them in the book, standing on a street corner in Morgantown, West Virginia, protesting this administration's cuts to the firefighter health and safety program. Or the NASA scientists, despite being on the chopping block, are still flying over the fires using lasers to map the fires of the future to tell the firefighters on the ground how better to fight the fires. Or the weather service folks who are being fired, the meteorologists en masse, even though they predicted this exact fire, and they said it was going to happen. Or the Forest Service men and women in the Pacific Northwest who were on a hiring freeze when I was there, despite the fact that it's a perpetual fire season. All of these people give me hope in a time like this, even though, yeah, I'm being dispatched to the gnarliest, craziest circumstances. But like I said to you at the beginning, Todd, like, it's my zone. I love to be there. I love to be with people, and it brings me a lot of joy to be with people in such hard times.
Your book isn't really about politics or politicians, but you have a wonderful, pretty dishy scene where you happen to be with Governor Newsom in the aftermath of
Yeah.
the newly inaugurated President Trump's first visit, where Governor Newsom engineers to have good manners and go meet him on the tarmac,
Yeah.
even though he wasn't really, invited. He had to kind of engineer an invitation. And just talk, that might have been the origin of Governor Newsom's pushback about the Trump
Oh, there's
administration.
no doubt about it. He said to me that kind of fighting the misinformation and the disinformation from the incoming Trump administration was the origin story of how he is pushing back kind of so publicly and impolitely now. And that started when he was watching in real time Elon Musk in this live stream push these firefighters, and all they wanted to do was get out there and work about the conspiracy theories about the water pressure. And he's watching it in real time, and he says to Izzy Gardner, his communications director, "Flip that son of a bee. Let's put it on the internet. F these guys. I'm not going to take this anymore." And so they put it online and said, like, this is a conspiracy theory. This is why it's a conspiracy theory. And that's been his sort of philosophy. 2 weeks later, when Trump came to town after visiting the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and then landing at LAX, he wasn't even invited to the tarmac. He had been begging to go. And they basically, at the very last minute, said, sure, show up. And on the tarmac, Trump kind of wanted him to come and be a part of his tour.
Dog and pony show.
Exactly. That turned into a very disastrous
with Mayor Bass.
Town hall with Mayor Bass in the Palisades at the press conference. Brad Sherman was there. It was a disaster. And Newsom said he had the foresight to say, as Trump turned around, he said, "You're going to get on Marine One with me?" And Newsom was like, "Nope, not going to do it.
Don't get on a helicopter if you don't know where it's going." Or
he said, "I don't even know where you're going to drop me off. I don't have my security guards. Like, I don't know if you're going to try and kill me. Like, I don't know what you're going to do."
A big dumper, as they say.
But they could have thrown him out the side of the thing. No, I don't think he speaks fondly of his relationship with Trump until the fires, and he said it totally fell apart.
Because in the Paradise fires and some of the previous fires in the first Trump administration, they did try to work cooperatively together with Governor Brown and with Governor Newsom, right?
When Newsom was governor-elect and Brown was still the governor when the Camp Fire happened in Paradise, the deadliest fire in California history, not the most destructive by cost, but the deadliest. Yeah, it was the beginning of their working relationship together. It was the raking of the forest stuff and all that other bizarre stuff, but it was definitely, they developed a personal relationship with each other. And I was with Newsom like 3 weeks ago for an interview you might have seen on MS, but when the book came out, and he said he has not talked to Trump, I want to make sure I get this right, since the ice raids, since the day before
in June,
ice raids in June. Yeah, exactly. And I had seen Newsom in the Emergency Operations Center in LA, and he had talked to Trump just the day before, and Trump has just ghosted him. Newsom went to Washington to try to meet with the administration. He said he couldn't even get an intern to meet with him from FEMA. And that's the nature of the relationship.
And they blocked him from the U.S. venue in Davos.
Exactly.
So when your family and friends see you coming, now that you're the master disaster, do they run the other way? Are you like Joe Blitzflug and Little Abner? Do you carry your own cloud?
It's pretty lonely out there. Everybody's just ditching me, and it's a bummer.
What's next for you? What's your next assignment? Do you know?
Going home next week. Hopefully, I'm not going anywhere. And seeing my kids who are 10 and 5, and I have not hung out with them except for 5 days this month. And then I'm sure I'll be back out there. The State of the Union's coming up. These raids are not stopping. And the aftermath of these disasters are not stopping. And I learned, I think, I really did have a chip on my shoulder, sort of my moral of the story about going out and covering disasters. And I thought everybody else is better at it than I am. We just parachute in and leave, and it's sort of performative. And I'll never think of doing this the same way ever again. I know what it's like to experience this and to be on the other side of it. And whether I'm covering ice or fire or ice, use the pun, I'll always approach this in a different way now.
Well, let's just say we hope you have only intermittent practice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really, really good.
Thank you guys for coming. I'll sign some books.
Yeah, he's
I did, yeah.